I'm Larry Jacobs. I'm a professor here at the University of Minnesota and the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, which is the University of Minnesota School of Public Affairs. I had the great honor about a dozen years ago to start programming in election administration, and holy smoke, that program has blossomed into something really special. And so I want to tell you a little bit about that and then get us started in this very important conference today. The core of our program here is known as Certificate in Election Administration, or for those in the know, CEA. And this, the certificate is oriented around a series of courses that are granted for credit at the University of Minnesota at the undergraduate and graduate level. The courses provide best practices for both current election officials and those who would like to get into the profession of election administration. It's an online course requiring 12 credits, and the instructors are all prominent leaders in election administration in Washington, D.C. and around the country, and we've got several of them in today's programs, actually organizers of today's programs. The courses are accessible, of course, 24 hours a day, anywhere in the world, and we find many of our students fitted into their working schedule and their private lives. Placement record for our graduates has been very strong, and we are accepting registration now for both the summer course and for the fall course. If you'd like more information, you can see the link here. Just want to give you a heads up, we've got a terrific course that is being taught by one of our presenters and moderators today, Jennifer Morrell, who in the election world is quite prominent for her work on audits and security. And her course is an introduction to election security, looks at threats with regards to cyber threats, as well as strategies to protect against them. Coming up in the fall, we've got a whole series of courses, again, taught by prominent people in election administration. Survey of election administration, from voter registration to recounts and more. A course on strategic management that looks at the political context in which elections are conducted. Voter participation, which is of course a key issue and faces significant challenges, both in terms of the general population, but then in terms of different groups of voters, including voters of color. And then we've got a course, again, this fall on physical and election security. Elections have been declared a critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security. This course goes into detail looking at what is entailed by that and some of the best practices. Another component of the Certificate in Election Administration are the webinars that we run, which are about once a month or once every other month, that bring together premier election officials, the top challenges facing the field and our country. As part of that, today's conference is, I think, just a remarkable event, as you're going to see shortly. It is addressing one of the major challenges that we have in election administration, which is misinformation and conspiracies, conspiracy theories about what's going on that are not grounded in reality. How do election officials address that? We're going to be talking about that today. And we want you to be part of the conversation. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. That's the green flag for you to send us questions. Please send us questions. We're going to get to as many as we possibly can. Before I turn things over, I want to just give a few thanks. I want to thank my colleagues, Sarah Benskofer, who was a coordinator for today's program, and Cody Jackett, who was the logistics magician who got us all here. And we're grateful to both of them. I'd also like to thank the small group that helped to organize today's conference and put together the panels, Jennifer Morrell, Tammy Patrick, and Judd Choate. And without further delay, I'd like to introduce Judd Choate.
Thank you, Larry. Appreciate it. And the wonderful crowd in the room that just applauded. You may have missed that. I'll give you sort of the run of show that you're going to see today, but I want to sort of start off by kind of describing to you the issue that brought us all here. So Larry and I worked on a paper together, and it was published this year in Annals, or will be. It's about our perspective on the 2020 election, and specifically how that election sort of being framed as an example of the fragility of democracy. And in fact, we believe that it's actually the opposite. It kind of shows all of the gates and checks and balances that go into securing an election, making sure that it's accurate, making sure that all of the work that we all do as elections administrators and those that work in the periphery of elections demonstrate the accuracy of an election outcome. So the conversation in the wider academic world and even in the media world is that that elections are actually in peril, and there is some evidence to worry about that. And frankly, when asked whether elections are dying, my answer is, well, they're a little under the weather because there are some things around elections which are worrisome. But at the same time, there are lots of things that we should feel demonstrate why we should have great confidence in elections and their outcomes. And we have difficulty as an industry sort of communicating those ideas, because communication skills are not what brought us to these positions, and in fact are often the kinds of strategies that are not sort of front of mind for us. We're sort of organizers and bean counters, and we like to make the trains run on time. Our skill set isn't necessarily working with media. So in having these conversations with Larry prior to working on that project, it became pretty apparent to us as we were working on it that there was a conversational sea change that was happening, where the people who were election deniers and people with conspiracy theories about elections were sort of winning the communications battle. If they weren't winning in mainstream media, they were winning through social media. So where people were sort of camped out in their own little corner of the internet, and it was difficult to get to those people. And so part of where this conference comes from is, how do we get to those people, and how do we constrain them from influencing the people that are outside of their circle by conveying better information, by giving the truth about how elections are run. And that was sort of the impetus. That was sort of the starting point. And I'll tell you a personal story, which I think sort of illustrates the problem of 2021 in my mind. I think many of us, perhaps all of us, are on Facebook or some relevant social media. And I had many friends, a lot of whom I grew up with, who I haven't really been in touch with over the last 20 years, but they're friends of mine on Facebook. Well, after the 2020 election, a number of them started posting things about how the election was clearly stolen. And I, after a while, thinking, well, this will go away. And of course, it didn't go away. It kept coming up, and the conspiracies and ideas became grander and more far-fetched. So I reached out to a number of them and said, hey, I don't know if you know this, but you actually know an elections professional, somebody that could really talk to you about some of these issues. And most of them sort of took the hint and stopped posting those things. Maybe they did it on different forums, but they didn't do it on Facebook. But one, who was probably my closest friend of the group, continued to do that. And after a while, I direct messaged her and said, hey, you know, this stuff is pretty offensive to me because it's untrue, and it really counters the work that I do and that many of my friends and colleagues do. We ended up on a phone call with one another, and we talked for an hour, and she asked dozens of questions, and I walked her through everything that we do. And at the end of that conversation, I said, well, you know, how do you feel now? I mean, do you have a little bit more confidence in what we do? And she said, you know, Judd, it sounds like you do amazing work. It sounds like Colorado's doing outstanding, but I still believe the election was stolen. And I said, well, how can you believe that after I've just described all this to you? And she effectively said, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but she effectively said, either you're too stupid to know that it's happening, or you're part of the conspiracy and you're just too good at communicating the story otherwise. And we agreed to disagree, obviously, and we went on with our lives. And about 6 weeks, 8 weeks later, she started reposting things again. And I had to defriend her because I just wasn't going to stand for that. And for me, that was sort of an event of 2021, was sort of illustrative of the challenge that we were faced that year, because it didn't matter that I could sit there and engage with a person one-on-one and communicate all of the things I knew to be true, basically convince her, but yet not be able to get her to understand that what I was saying was accurate, not only for me, but for across the country. So I walked away from 2021, even though I understood what Larry and I had worked on this paper, that we have all these checks and balances, we have all these gates that protect our elections, but people out there don't believe that. They don't understand that. And we're missing the chance to communicate that to them properly. So that's where this conference came from. It came from that conversation about how do we reach those people? And if we can't reach those people, how do we reach the people around them who can still be influenced? So anyway, that's sort of the origin of how this all started. And then Tammy Patrick's joined the group, and we started kind of building out this conference and figuring out who would be our sort of all-star panels and chairs. And that's, you know, how we are here today at the Humphrey Institute or Humphrey School, sort of talking you through these issues. Let me walk you through what we're going to have today. So the first panel I'm going to chair, it's going to be about these sort of larger communication ideas and understanding where the mis and disinformation is coming from, and what are the channels by which we can, you know, have this conversation. The second panel, we're going to go very micro, and we're going to go at the local election level. Tammy Patrick is going to lead a conversation about Maricopa County and what Maricopa County encountered with the cyber ninjas and the Arizona Senate, all the things that happened in Arizona. So really looking forward to sort of a deep dive on the Maricopa issue. Then we have a panel with Jessica Huseman will chair, which is about what different states are doing to combat mis and disinformation and get good information out there. And I'll just give you a little clue on this. They're taking very different strategies, and the very different strategies are working. So there are various ways in which you can do this. It's just you have to be somewhat aggressive. You have to do something. And so again, that's part of what the big note out of this conference, or out of that panel in particular, will be. And then Gauri Ramachandran will lead the last panel, and they're going to talk about sort of what are the bigger takeaways. What can you as an elections administrator do to sort of walk away from this with tangible ways to affect the communication of the work that you do and convince those that are important, both your voters and then the press and other leaders in your community, that the work that you did was accurate. And so that's what we're hoping that last panel will do. So there are 4 panels. We'll go through until the early afternoon, at least for those in the Central and Eastern time zones. My apologies for those in Alaska or on the West. You are all up awful early this morning, but we're so happy that you were able to join us. All right, so the first panel about communicating these election ideas, I'll chair it, and we have Pam Fessler from former correspondent from National Public Radio. We all know Pam from basically every election story in the last 20 years, where we could listen to all of her great stories about what was happening in the election world. We also have Dan Carpenter, who is the Ali Freed Professor of Government at Harvard. He's going to talk to us about sort of this broader historical perspective of reputations in government. And then we have Jacobo Lincona, who's the founder of the JL Research Group. And he is a specialist in social media, and specifically how social media affects people who are Latino or Spanish speaking. So he has a real sort of more micro perspective on how this particular issue is affecting a group of people in our electorate. So let me kick it off, and I'll kick it off with a first question to Pam. So my description of 2021 where I felt like we were clearly, elections administrators were clearly losing the battle of communications, both in the broader perspective in the media, but also through social media and these sort of corners of the internet. Do I have that right? Is that what you see? And what can we do about that?
Yeah, oh, that's a broad question. Yeah, definitely. As we have all talked about, 2020 was probably one of the best run elections that most of us have had experiences with, especially considering there was a pandemic. But then you have this public trust. All of the polls show this incredible decline in public trust and confidence in the results. And what to me is most astonishing is that decline in public trust has persisted. So you look at the polls and you still have this 30–40% of people who just totally believe that the election was stolen. And two interesting things. I think one of the things is if you look at those polls, most people will think that their local election was probably okay. That their local election official was probably honest and probably did a good job. It's those other people, like your friend from Facebook, right? And so to me, what it means is that the election community, it's sort of a multi-pronged effort is required for how you attack this issue, right? So you need to talk to your local voters, work with your local media, convince them. But I think that the election community as a whole also has to work together and send out this broader message that this is a wonderful election system that we have in this country, and to actually promote it. This is, people talk a lot about, and you alluded to this, you guys are bean counters for a lot of part, right? You figure facts and data are going to make your case. But most people who've done research on this, you don't convince people with fact. If they disagree with you, you are not going to persuade them with facts and numbers. You're going to persuade them with something a little bit more essential. You have to get at that. What is it that's making them not want to believe that the elections are secure? And we have to appeal to that, that this is a democratic system. It's a patriotic system. We're all part of it, and make people feel like it is, something that they should support. So it's going to take a whole different mindset than I think a lot of election officials are used to.
Yeah, it's almost tapping into emotion more.
Oh, much more, and narratives and stories, and like you mentioned, you said, oh, we remember Pam Fessler's stories over the past 20 years. Well, they were stories. Right. They were about people. That these are your neighbors and your friends, that this is voting process, this is part of America, and you have to capture that.
Yeah, that's great. Dan, let's bring you into the conversation. So I hope I'm not putting too fine a point on this. You are a political scientist, but I have to tell you, I've done a lot of reading of your work in the last week or so, and you strike me as a historian as well. So maybe you can give me a historic perspective on how are there examples of governmental offices and agencies that have faced this kind of scrutiny, faced this sort of reputational challenge, and succeeded, sort of found their way out to a better reputation?
Thanks, Judd. Let me just first say, as to me being a historian, I resemble that comment. I'm often accused by my fellow political scientists of spending too much time in the archives and with historical data. And let me just also first say that I had planned to be with all of you today. I unfortunately came down with COVID about 4 or 5 days ago, and I was not able to make it in person. But I'm well, and I do miss the in-person presence. I'm reminded when I think about this, we've had a number of times in our history, in American history, when things have been so divided that people have believed in alternative realities on the basis of partisanship. And one of those is roughly the period from the 1850s, even through the Civil War and well after, and into the 1890s, into the Progressive era, when there were just stark partisan divides. And yet, something I wrote about in one of my first books was a time when different administrators, including people who founded things like the Forest Service as we know it, or the FDA as we know it, kind of reached out and built really broad coalitions, in part by effective communications. So one of the things I wanted to emphasize in this moment was, I take the title of this event seriously, in the sense of going on the offensive. This is not something we can say, we're just going to lay out the facts, as Pam's stories just mentioned, and as Judd, your story mentioned. There are active forces, unfortunately, trying to undermine our elections. This is, unfortunately, a form of international warfare now, because we know that some of these forces are coming from overseas, some of the same forces that are using their militaries to destroy other countries. And I think in that sense, I want to sort of point to two strategies that I think worked in the past. The one is, and I want to agree with everything that Pam just said, and all this, also the suggestions that you just made, Judd. The first is to find allies, and to find, if you will, even strange or odd allies. I was struck, and I continue to be struck. I don't know if the following, I'm going to pose the following as a hypothesis. Some of the people who, and some of the Republicans who are more likely to stand up to former President Trump and his claim that the election was stolen seem to be from some of the reddest of states. And I'm thinking here of people like Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, and others. And I think it's important for, those allies may not be incredibly plentiful, but there may be people willing to come out and say, no, the election was not stolen. And I, as a, ruby red Republican from Utah, from South Dakota, from Idaho, am willing to say this. And I think it's going to be important for election administrators and or others. And maybe this is less of a cross-partisan coalition than a geographic coalition, for people, say, in Michigan and North Carolina to contact their fellow elections administrator and officials in places like Idaho, in places like Montana, and places like North and South Dakota, to say, yeah, here's the way we do all these things, and to kind of come together across the states and do that. The other thing I wanted to mention is, the 2020 election was different in a whole bunch of ways, in part because of the pandemic. If in fact the pandemic recedes, and we hopefully, I'm speaking in aspirational terms here, spend all of us a little less time on our devices, then maybe some of this will wane. But the aspect that also I think I saw at the root of a lot of conspiracy theorizing was mail ballots. Now, many elections in states, Oregon, Colorado, yours, Judd, have been doing this for a long time. But clearly the use of mail ballots arose. And here I think actually there's an opportunity for election administrators to partner with one of the most trusted agencies in American history, which is the U.S. Postal Service. Is the Postal Service always perfectly efficient? No, we know about many mail delays. The vast majority of people trust the postal system for their delivery. And in fact, some of the very constituencies where you've seen, some of the rural constituencies where you've seen people express doubt about the election results are the same constituencies where the post office is most heavily trusted. And if you doubt that, take a look at what's going on in terms of the very few bipartisan things coming out of Congress right now, one of them being postal reform, which just passed the Senate. I don't know the numbers, but overwhelmingly bipartisan. Even deep red Republican constituencies know that they need to invest in the Postal Service. It's a remarkable transformation from, say, even the 1990s. And so exactly how that's done, we can get into, but I actually think that as ballots and as the postal system becomes more and more commonly integrated into our election systems across states, I actually think this presents an opportunity and not a risk. Well, partly a risk, but really a grand opportunity for election administrators.
Great, thank you, Dan. Jacobo, let me get you in here. So when we think of sort of disinformation, I think of it, or I have historically thought of it as sort of a monolith. You know, there are people speaking, saying things that are untrue. I react to that as an elections administrator. But in thinking this through and talking to you and some others, it has become apparent to me that it's actually not a monolith. There are particular designs in this mis and disinformation where they're targeting particular audiences. And this is the kind of research you do. So sort of tell us, how has election mis and disinformation been directed directly to Latino voters, to Spanish-speaking voters?
Yeah, thanks, Judd. Thank you for letting me be part of this panel. And I think this is a really important conversation to be having. I think when it comes to disinformation, misinformation, targeting the Latino community, targeting communities of color, targeting communities that primarily speak another language than English, I think there's a lot of, they're targeting these communities heavily. It's people in the United States, it's people, foreign governments, it's also, in particular in Spanish, Latin America has a big role to play in this space as well. And I think part of the reason why these communities are being impacted so heavily with this information is because of the lack of resources and understanding of what they're being targeted with. They're often being targeted with the same type of disinformation and misinformation that we see kind of maybe in the broader disinfo ecosystem. So for example, in elections, we definitely see the same stuff as Dan mentioned around like COVID, a lot of the mail process, the vote by mail process, that was a conversation that there was a lot of disinformation around. And maybe not even just disinformation, but also just creating confusion. That's one big piece that is also happening by these same actors. It's not necessarily always disinformation or misinformation, but also just creating so much confusion that you don't really understand how the process works, or you're not really sure what to believe anymore. There's a great level of uncertainty. It's not always that they're believing the information, it's just that they're not really sure what is true or false now. So when it came to the vote by mail process, people were confused on even how to vote by mail, especially in these communities of color. There was definitely a lot of investments as the elections was happening to make sure that that people could understand the process. And I think as it got closer, more and more people did understand how it worked, but there was also just so much actors going after talking about the same conversation in the same way. And so that's where the confusion was building up. I think in particular when it comes though with the Latino community and kind of something to keep in mind is that Latinos are very diverse and complex. So the Latino community just on its own is not a monolith and do not vote as a block. And so that's something also that's very important that, for example, in South Florida, there was a lot of misinformation targeted at the Cuban community specifically. That may not be the same type of information that people in, for example, South Texas, where it's maybe more of the Mexican community they're being targeted with a completely different type of misinformation and disinformation. And so I think that's something that's important to note. But I think another piece that's particularly important when it comes to non-English language information is the presence of like information voids or news deserts. Particularly in Spanish, there's a huge level of Spanish language information voids where Univision and Telemundo played a role for some people in getting news and information to them. But there's also many Latinos who just feel left out of mainstream American society and politics. They're made to feel kind of ill-equipped or unentitled to engage in politics or in elections and democracy. And so they may not think that politics is, relevant, or they feel neglected by both parties, by the election system, by democracy. And so they're not getting the full story from mainstream media. And then they go to social media to get their news and information. So Latinos in particular over-index on the use of social media, but also consuming news on social media. And with these information voids, we often see them being filled with bad information. So we often see it being filled with disinformation, misinformation, problematic narratives about the voting process and how it works. And that's causing levels of uncertainty. I think one thing that we have to be careful about is like when we talk about the susceptibility of disinformation, it's not necessarily that maybe Latinos are more susceptible to disinformation. They're just definitely being targeted with it and are familiar with a lot of the disinfo narratives. And there's a level of uncertainty on kind of what is true and what is false.
Great. So one of the strategies that some elections administrators have employed is buying ads on Facebook, buying ads on Google, trying to get at the top of the search. Does that sound like that would make sense given the consumption of those media?
I think that's definitely very important to do. I think one thing in particular is to try to understand where people are getting their news or where they're spending their time online. Not just with the Latino community, but really any community. I think that's the one key aspect, is that we can't just be going to traditional news anymore. We should still be going there, but we should also look at other areas where people are spending their time. And like I said earlier, Latinos are spending more time on social media. So for example, and not just Latinos, but the Black community, white community, Hispanic community, Asian community are spending a lot of time on YouTube specifically. Latinos specifically are spending like 80% of Latinos are going to YouTube to get news and information. And one of the groups I work with, Ekis, actually did some research on where they're consuming news and information in the 2020 election. And they found that 2/3 of Latinos are getting election and political information from YouTube. And as someone who monitors and tracks kind of disinformation areas, when you go on YouTube and try to see stuff in Spanish, you're getting a wide range of different conversations. And oftentimes it is this problematic narratives, these disinformation narratives that are spreading. And so it's really important to go where they are. So even creating YouTube videos, or like you said, using Google search to make sure that, when people are searching for election information in Spanish, that maybe the local elections office pops up at the top to make sure that, and in Spanish as well, so that they can kind of understand how the election process works, how to vote and things like that, instead of getting maybe some of this more problematic content that's appearing on Google, YouTube, and Facebook and other social media platforms.
Really interesting. So Pam, most elections administrators, they don't really have a relationship with social media. They might have, their office may have a Facebook page.
Right.
They might have a Twitter handle, but other than that, they really just don't. How can elections administrators, both the big ones who have sort of an infrastructure to be able to do this, but elections administrators from small offices where they might have 3 people working elections in an office, how can they sort of tap into this group or develop relationships with local media to try to get that message out?
Well, I was interested in what Jacobo said, because there's been some research that was done, I guess it was in 2000, a survey of election offices. And they found that, I was shocked by this. While most have websites, right? Only 34% had Facebook pages and only 8% were on Twitter. I mean, it's pretty astonishing, especially since that's where all of the conspiracy theories were being spread. So clearly, elections offices need to focus more of their attention on these social media sites. I think the other thing, and Dan brought this up, you talk about allies. Traditionally, the media has it's more kind of an adversarial relationship, as it should, with government. But I think in this particular case, in this particular story, whether or not our elections, how they're being run, and whether they can be trusted, I think the media is definitely your ally for the most part, right? Because if anybody is interested in the truth, it is the news media, journalists. That's what they are trying, at least, legitimate news media sources. They want to report the truth. And that's what you want to get out there. You want to get that out to the public. But I think one of the things is that a lot of local election offices don't really have a relationship with their local reporters. And I think it is very, very crucial now, before the election, reach out to those reporters ahead of time, find out who in your area is covering elections or might cover election. If you're in a small jurisdiction, maybe it's just the editor of the local newspaper. Bring them in, say, hey, we'd like you to see how we operate. We can give you a tour. You could do a story about it. You could come watch poll worker training. Develop that relationship now before some big story emerges because, something happened in your county that all of a sudden somebody on the national stage decides is evidence of fraud. And you all of a sudden find yourself bombarded with media because you're on the defensive. You need to be on the offensive. You want to get this story out, and you should find out who the local reporters are, the person who's going to be covering, sit down with them informally, maybe just a background check, a background talk. Here's my phone number. Here's the best way to reach me in an emergency. What's your phone number? Because you need to know that you can trust that reporter too, that if you need to share something with them on background to kind of explain what's going on, that they're, will respect that, but that they will actually accurately report what's going on. And it needs to be done now. If it hasn't been done already, don't wait until October or late October, right. Because then it's really going to be too late, because then, the stories will be, it'll be the critics who will be setting the tone of the coverage. And then they'll be coming to you saying, well, do you have a comment? And you might say, I don't know. I have to find out.
So this is for any of my colleagues from Colorado who are watching, they'll know that we often will reach out to them and say before an election, hey, have you talked to your DAs? Are you all set for post-election? Because there are various reasons why you would need to talk to your DA. You should reach out to your judge, your district court judge, make sure that they're aware election's going to be on Tuesday. There may be a last minute issue that will crop up that they should be open and be available to take, a case at 6:30 at night on election day. So this is part of that list of people that you should be communicating with ahead of the election. Hey, I'm Judd, I'm the elections administrator. You know me a little bit, but let's exchange cell numbers. Let's make sure that you can contact me if you have questions and I can alert you to some issue that's pending.
Right. And because of 2020, especially, you have a lot more reporters who are going to be covering the 2022 election and covering it from the aspect of, did everything go okay? Can people actually trust what's going on with the count? And you have a lot of reporters who've never covered this before. As you know, for many years, I was the only person who did it. Now there are a lot more. Especially since 2016, I think you have a lot more. But it's really important in the same way that you educate your voters on how the process works. So you need to educate your voters. You need to help educate the reporters. Yeah. And if that exposes you to maybe some coverage about things that aren't working well, that's good. What you want, if there's something that's not working well, then fix it. It's part of the cost of getting coverage and being transparent. This is a process that we all are part of. And clearly some people want to make sure that it's, that the public can trust you. And quite frankly, the public is going to trust you more if you sometimes admit if something is wrong and you're transparent about it and say, look, this didn't work, and we're going to try and fix it.
Yeah, the lemonade scenario.
Right. Now, can I just say one other thing? The one thing is that, of course, our media landscape is so different now. So you do have the mainstream news organizations, but you do have all these other media outlets, and also social media sources that might not actually be interested in covering things accurately. So you have to kind of figure out which are the ones that can be more of your allies in exposing the
build
truth.
the right relationships.
Right.
Yeah. Great. So Dan, I alluded to the fact that that Larry and I were on a panel earlier this week in which they suggested that democracy was dying or democracy was in decline. Do you see that? Is that something that's at all worrisome to you, that in fact we are sort of on the precipice of the decline of democracy?
Yes, I want to, I mean, this is a global phenomenon. And I think, I want to recommend an excellent book by my two colleagues, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, called How Democracies Die. And, I think the argument that they're pointing to and the concerns that they're pointing to are not so much, a military coup or an authoritarian takeover by an executive official, but that, different forces, often parties, it often happens when a party says, all right, we're just going to kind of game the system and use the rules. It's happened in Hungary. It's happened in part in Turkey, happened in some other places. Gerrymandering is a big problem. And so, do I have a sour prediction about, the death of American democracy in the next 10 to 20 years? No, but I think people need to be vigilant. And it is going to depend on many of the same kinds of, just to put quite frankly, battles that we're talking about here. People who are pushing for, healthy, fair, systematized elections are, going to also have to be pushing for healthy, fair, systematized legislative processes, courts, and criminal justice, and a range of other things. I guess just, I wanted to add two things I think that are related in this respect to what Pam and Jacobo said. The first, in Jacobo's point about YouTube, I found interesting, and I think it's worth doing this for election administrators and for state government officials to think about doing this. I mean, and many already are. Is to use celebrities and or surrogates or public service announcements. And when I say celebrities, it doesn't just mean the person who's the best known on the planet. In part because we're dealing with a highly variegated, media and consumption landscape. It might mean somebody who is a celebrity in, as Jacobo said, South Texas or in the Miami area. Or in Michigan, in Minnesota, and to find an ally like that, and literally, have a Democrat and a Republican, or people who are quite different, stand on camera and say, "Hey, look, you can trust your local elections. We've seen this. We toured around. We did the tour that Judd and Pam just talked about of." Looking at the processes in the last election, you can trust this, that kind of thing. Is that going to persuade everybody? Is that going to persuade the hardest nosed conspiracy theorists? No, but I think it could potentially make an important dent. I think the other thing is that needs to happen. And again, this is, I think, might sound a little bit more aggressive in the sense of going on the offensive, but there are some people who are casting doubt on these election results, who are conspiracy theorists, and there are some, unfortunately, who are we're dealing with the forces of global authoritarianism. And this is, again, especially coming out of places like Russia. And other countries. And I think, sometimes one needs to know who your enemy is, and at some level, undermine them actively. And what I mean by that is, what we saw in the last election was some cases where there were election or voting machine companies that actively sued the people who were, casting doubt on their machines. And that did more than put those folks on the hook for multi-million-dollar judgments. It also forced them into depositions, forced them into discovery. It used the lawful tools, not unlawful, but lawful Republican, small r Republican tools of our legal system to basically compel those people to testify truthfully as to what they were saying. And, you know, that's always potentially, you know, should the machinery of the courts be used in cases like this? It depends. If somebody, you know, go back to Schenck v. US, the right to free speech does not include the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. You know, so if there are particular agents who are actively undermining our democracy, yes, one has to use the tools of that democracy and the tools of democratic sovereignty to undermine them. And, you know, as long as that's done with procedural due process and equal protection of the law, I think it has to be done.
That's a really great point, and several great points there. I jotted some notes down. The joke, sort of humorous, sort of not so, is that Smartmatic and Dominion may soon only do voting machines as a sidelight to their cable news network. Of course, we'll see how that goes, because all of that is currently in litigation. So we had an online question that's perfect for you, Jacobo. Paul Huffman asks, so participation in elections has become more difficult. And I think this is especially the case in many areas where there are larger populations of Latino voters or Spanish language voters. And does this mean that we as elections administrators really need to sort of proactively be doing education campaigns on how the elections are run? What are the changes? And in doing that, get out in front of these issues, get in the conversation, become the trusted source that people can look to and engage with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think Pam and Dan both made really good points about building trust with local reporters or surrogates or celebrities. I think that's something that's very important to do. And I think it's important to do it not just like leading up to the election, but have it consistent, like not think of it from a election cycle perspective, because I think a lot of the work is viewed that way, but building trust always, even in 2023, when there may, I mean, some counties may have elections, but even if there's a non-election year, to continue building that trust and have it ongoing and not necessarily just focus on it, you know, in October or September leading up to the election when it may already be too late, or there's already been so much disinformation spreading for months, or since 2020, it hasn't really even kind of stopped the disinformation era. So kind of building that trust from the very beginning and continuing to build that communication, I think is key. And I think one thing that Judd, you mentioned is that some, or Pam, you mentioned that some don't even have social media profiles or things like that. And I think maybe it may be difficult to build that presence online. Like, does an average voter want to follow their election administration office? Maybe not, or maybe they don't have that interest. So what can we do to build that instead of building the actual social media profile? Is doing what Pam and Dan said. What if there's a local, maybe it's not a celebrity, but local trusted messengers in the community? It can be, when it comes to Latino communities, there's always, local organizations that there's these local leaders that are kind of the face of the Latino community oftentimes, reaching out to those people, reaching out to others, whether it's local reporters. Sometimes for even smaller communities, there's always that, hometown hero who maybe became famous of some sort, those type of people, and trying to kind of reach out to them who do have that presence online and do it via that way. And I think sometimes in terms of, do we need to teach people how to vote, create these videos? Yes, I think you should definitely post those on YouTube, but also maybe, I mean, it's crazy to say this because it wasn't even a thing a few years ago, like even TikTok for the younger community. It's become insane how popular it is and how many views it gets. But there's also so many of these local TikTok influencers. What if you teach them to do the video? Like, tell them to teach people how to vote, how to use the vote by mail process, or other influencers, instead of doing it yourself, just teaching them to do it, but at the same time making sure that you also have those YouTube videos on your own website or on so that people can access those sources. but maybe having it from a wide variety of different people kind of talking about it. I think that's very important.
So Akabo, you demonstrate how much cooler you are than I am, because in my mind, I was thinking what we really need to do is do a bunch of these you're a bill on Capitol Hill kind of 3 to 5 minute videos. And you're talking about TikTok, you're like so much more sophisticated than I am. But what do you think of that idea? I mean, I learned how Congress worked by watching ABC Sunday Morning. Does that make sense?
I mean, I don't think it doesn't not make sense. I think it should definitely be, you should definitely have those videos if you can make them, if you can do those videos and have them up, because I think there's some people who do want to see that. There are people who do want to go to the local election office, who do when people refer to your official source, refer to, more credible news and information. I think a lot of people often do go to the .gov websites, the local county websites. And so I think it's important to have those there. I think just doing both is key, making sure that, because there's so many people consuming news in so many different ways, having it in different avenues, I think is important.
Yeah, if I can add something to that, and it's in some research I'm doing, I'm trying to work on a communications guide for our local election officials with the elections group. One of the things that seems to be pretty effective is some jurisdictions are starting to use social media, right? And so they'll have a very brief message, which research shows the briefer the better. That's what's going to get attention. That's what's going to actually resonate with people. But they might have a link to something that's a little like your video on how a bill is made or whatever, or how a vote is happening. So it's good to have that information available, but that's not what's going to necessarily bring people in. And actually, one other point I did want to make, and this goes a little bit back to what Dan was saying. Talking about allies, I've noticed that there's a lot of reticence among election officials, local election officials, to speak for other jurisdictions, right? They'll say, look, I know our system is secure, things are, very good here. I'm not 100%, it's probably okay over there in the next state, but I don't know. But I really think that election officials have to get over that. I think there are things that you can talk about. That most of these allegations of fraud and irregularities are not true. How well trained people are, even in other states. You certainly know what requirements there are within your own state and security measures. And I think people, that as a community have to speak up for the national system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, so I'm a big baseball fan. Everybody who knows me knows that. I always think of it as the fields are never shaped the same. The dynamics of the field are different in each park, but we're all basically playing the same game. We're all doing it effectively the same way.
Right.
So when you communicate that your election is being run well, you should also at the same time be communicating that other people's elections are also being run well.
Right, because those efforts to undercut confidence somewhere else and attack somewhere else is affecting confidence in your system as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have time for just like one more quick question. You brought up the guide. I want you to kind of describe this a little bit, the work that you've been doing with the election group. And when will we see that? And can people get a hold of it so that they can maybe use it to sort of bring out some of these ideas?
Yeah, it's going to be pretty soon. I would say within a month, certainly it'll be available, and it'll be available to basically anybody who wants it. And we're just trying to look at, what are the things that election officials can do. Some of which we have talked about here today, such as, getting these relationships with local reporters, getting allies, working with, coalitions, and also more broadly, how to tell that story of elections, right? That story that's going to inspire people, not only to want to vote, but also to believe in the system. And it's going to be really good.
Yeah. Well, your name's attached to it, so I'm sure it will be.
I really don't know what I'm talking about, but it will read well.
Well, so we are all out of time. It seems like 45 minutes flew by. I want to thank Dan Carpenter, Jacopo Lancona. By the way, you should know, Dan, I hope you feel better. He's been under the weather and unable to join us in person. And Jacobo is literally moving today, and he took time from a move to come and join us on this panel. So we really appreciate that. And of course, the world-renowned Pam Fessler, too, for joining us. It was a fantastic panel. We're going to take a moment, and Tammy's going to come up, and she's going to kick off her panel. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Who stepped away for a moment to refresh before the second panel. My name is Tammy Patrick, and I'm a senior advisor at the elections team at Democracy Fund and an adjunct professor here at the University of Minnesota. And when we started planning this conference, and I saw that there was going to be a session about Maricopa County, I said, oh, please, 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 can I be the one that gets to moderate that panel? Because I'm always so excited to hear what's happening in my former jurisdiction and where my heart still lives. So I'm thrilled today to get started on this conversation, because I know it's going to fly by. One quick housekeeping note is that the chat function is not working properly, so there will be a link to a Google Doc that will be put in the chat in a moment here. You can click on that link to the Google Doc. It is safe and secure, so if you've been going through your TTXs and various cybersecurity trainings, we promise it's okay. Click on that, and then you can put your questions there. You can also, I would imagine, be able to put it in Twitter. We have been using the tentative hashtag of election accuracy. So that's another mechanism I know some of us here in the room have been following along on Twitter. So with that said, I want to jump in and get started, because I have three individuals that I'm thrilled to talk to today. First of all, we will be hearing from Stephen Richer, who is the Maricopa County Recorder, elected in 2020. What an infamous time to be elected there, sir. So welcome. And then we also will be hearing from Megan Gilbertson, the Director of Communications for Maricopa County. And we, of course, coordinated what we're going to wear today. Not really, but I'm glad that you got the memo as well, Jen, because we are all very, very Arizona in our color landscape up here. And then also Jen Feifeld, who is the Arizona reporter for VoteBeat, formerly with the Arizona Republic. What I really wanted to do today is, many of us followed the headlines, we read the stories, but I wanted to hear from the three of you what your perspective is about what happened, what worked well, what maybe didn't work so well, so we can learn some lessons there. So we're going to start off with you, Recorder Richer. I would love to hear your kind of timeline of what's happened since the election. Did you think this was the job you were running for? And if so, will you ever run for it again? Are you going to seek a second term after your first one has been so memorable? But I'd like to hear from you just a little bit of your perspective around what has been happening and how you have led the charge in 2021, probably doing a job that you didn't know was going to be the job you were running for.
Yeah, no, I certainly couldn't have predicted this. I certainly couldn't have predicted that of all the counties in all the states in all the world, the election integrity conversation would center on Maricopa County. But I think we in Georgia really have been the focuses over the past year, and that's largely because of the continued review of the 2020 election by multiple groups. I think most infamously a group called the Cyber Ninjas. And so it's been a pretty bleak portrayal into humanity's soul. What distinguishes us as creatures is our ability to reason. And I have fundamentally questioned that ability after the past year and a half. I think this has been a war not just on election administration, but a war on truth. I think that this has been a war on the epistemological process. We are no longer living in a world in which you can make a logical argument and you can show people the facts, and that's that. But we're living in a world in which, he who shouts loudest, he who shouts most frequently, he who is undeterred by any evidence to the contrary can keep pushing forward. And increasingly, people aren't even talking to each other. They're operating in different media ecosystems. So, yeah, I've given a lot of thought. And because I'm a competitive person, I think I too often fall into the pitfall of wanting to score points. And so when we think about what's worked well over the last few years and what should be done differently, I've broken people into three camps, and I have the professionals, the politicians, and the people. So the people are the people that are Megan is communicating to on a regular basis, and that's the 4.6 million people in Maricopa County, the 2.6 million registered voters, and those are the people who aren't living a political life, but are, consuming a little bit of news here and there, and are participating in the midterm and general elections, and maybe some of the jurisdictional elections, although we'd love for them to participate at a higher rate. So for them, I think you have to get, and this is very tempting, to get away from the point scoring game, get away from the you're dumb, what your assumptions are wrong, you're spreading disinformation, and get towards back into the business of befriending and building trust. And I think the 2020 election misinformation has its roots in the fact that we no longer have a definitive source of truth. I think rightfully or wrongfully, a lot of people lost confidence, lost trust, lost friendship, lost partnership with the mainstream media. And so they started looking to alternative outlets, and those alternative outlets weren't beholden to the same sorts of journalistic standards, the same types of editorial process. And so, that has really opened the field for a deluge of misinformation. And so rather than telling those people why they're wrong, I think we have to build relationships with those people. We have to bring them into their office to show that we're not three-headed monsters who are running this in a manipulative manner, but we're humans, we're their fellow Arizonans, we're their neighbors who are doing this. And so hopefully when they say, maybe I should think twice about that, because I met that Megan Gilbertson lady and she seemed like a nice, moral, reasonable individual. And so maybe I should take what she said seriously and give it some thought. So the second group is politicians. This is where I'm especially disappointed, because these are the people who have the information. These are the people who know better. These are the people who, have even sort of gone quietly into a dark hole of disinformation, even with their knowledge. And I think this is represented by the audio that was released yesterday regarding a conversation between Minority Leader McCarthy in the U.S. House and Liz Cheney. And McCarthy pretty much said that he knows the election stuff from 2020 is nonsense. He advocated for Trump to resign in the post-January 6th election context. But obviously that's no longer the position that he has taken. So what's changed? And it's really the incentive structure. The incentive structure has been stacked to favor those Republican politicians who will continue promoting the big lie, whether because of the primary systems that are set up, or because of fundraising purposes, or because it's an avenue to gaining the endorsement of the former president. And so I think we have to look as a political community, how do we change that incentive structure such that people like McCarthy, who know better, who admitted as much, and there are, I would say, about 75% of elected Republicans fall into that camp, but are willing to go along with the big lie because it's currently politically advantageous. And the last community is professionals. And I'm a lawyer, so I think most frequently of the Bar Association, but I do not think that professional communities have done enough to discipline their members into appropriate behavior in the election context. So whereas I said normal people shouldn't be made fun of, they shouldn't be ostracized, they shouldn't be chastised for maybe having some misconceptions about how elections are administered, I don't believe that is the case with professionals. And I don't think groups have taken enough steps to discipline their members. So here in Arizona, we had one of the Kraken iterations that was filed, and yet no action has been taken by the State Bar Association to discipline attorneys who knowingly presented something that was false, who did zero fact check into it, and who really damage our institutions by putting forward those claims. I think, again, also in in industries like journalism. I think that there should be more of you should become a pariah within the journalistic industry if you don't look into checking some of these things, if you don't do the legwork. So I think that's, an area where we could do better, because then if these professionals are not advancing these claims, then hopefully it doesn't trickle down to average people. So hopefully that's a little bit of a landscape. No, it's by no means what I expected, but it's been a worthwhile ride. I truly believe that this is the fight of our decade. And I truly believe that elections, like I said, are just a proxy war for a greater war on truth.
Well, thank you. And I don't think it's something that any of us expected. If someone had told me a few years ago that we would be repeatedly discussing cyber ninjas and bamboo ballot paper, I would have thought they were absolutely crazy. And I do think that you're right. Accountability is going to be critical, and getting people to say into the mic what they are more than willing to discuss off the mic is going to be a big challenge. And I know you said that you're a competitive person, but you also aren't allocating points. But I will say that my panel now has 1 point for epistemological process references. So just so that you all know, if you're playing along at home in the speaker panel bingo, that's, I think, the center square. So with that, I want to turn to Megan. So Megan, I have been so thrilled to see the way in which the office and your staff and yourself and everyone there have embraced this moment to really try and get ahead of the game with what is the truth, what are the facts. And so I would love to hear from you kind of like how this has played out. So what has been your strategy around the social media, the specific website, because it wasn't just combating one narrative. There were so many things you were combating. And so you had to designate a whole source portion of the website to this. So walk us through from a communication professional's perspective, because we have, a few hundred people on the line today and who will be watching this over time when it gets posted. And for many offices, they are the comms person. So as Jed mentioned earlier, it's a skill set. So I would love to hear from you, what happened? How did you maintain your sanity? And what are some of the things that the smaller offices that don't have the ability, and some would say the luxury, but I don't think it's a luxury in this day and age anymore to have designated communication professionals. It's a necessity. So welcome, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Tammy. I really appreciate you having me and inviting me here. I love the University of Minnesota. Minnesota is my home state. So even though I live in Arizona and I probably will live there for the rest of my life, I still love it here. So let me first dive into the incredible speed at which misinformation spreads. My first dive into it was Sharpiegate. And so let me just give you a little background. For decades in Maricopa County, we encouraged voters to steer clear of ink that would bleed through the ballot because it could cause overvotes on the opposite side of the ballot. So in 2019, Maricopa County redesigned our ballots to have offset columns so that bleed through wouldn't be an issue anymore. And we tested a variety of ink to make sure it wouldn't gum up our new optical scan precinct-based tabulators. And we landed with the manufacturer recommended Sharpie. And we used the new pen without much fanfare for the presidential preference election, 2 jurisdictional elections, and the August primary election in 2020. We even included information about the new ballot in our marketing and comm strategy from January to March in 2020. But then one kind of big thing happened in March, COVID-19. So we had to pivot pretty quickly our public messaging for the primary election. And instead of talking about the new ballot, we focused on informing voters about the new safety measures in place, about our brand new Vote Anywhere, Vote Center model, and provide them information about all of their voting options, including our robust early voting options. We saw some chatter about concerns with security and oversight after the primary election, so we added messaging going into the 2020 general election to address these areas, including creating informational videos and infographics on early ballot security, drop box security, tabulation security, and we even created a video about the type of ink that voters could use and how bleed-through wouldn't impact tabulation. During the general election, reporters called actually during early voting to say that people were telling them that Sharpies and bleed-through would invalidate their vote. We did media interviews on the topic. We shared our informational video, and we were even able to assuage the Arizona Attorney General, who sent an official request asking for us to provide evidence that Sharpies didn't invalidate votes. But after election day, voters clung on to the fear that their vote wasn't counted because of Sharpies. And that fear was spread by influential social media accounts, even though the truth was widely reported. While it was easily debunked, this piece of misinformation was then used in lawsuits, and it's really what began the uproar in Arizona. So let's fast forward to the cyber ninjas and 2021. The difference between Sharpiegate and the cyber ninjas is authority. Sharpiegate was spread online and debunked by top elected officials of both parties in Arizona, but the mis, dis, and malinformation that was spread by the cyber ninjas was authorized and endorsed by the state Senate. So media interviews and a video, it just wasn't going to be enough to dispel the true malinformation being spread by the cyber ninjas. So we needed to create a platform where we could use to send to the media and share with the public so they could get accurate information. We decided to create a web page that would be dedicated to this, and we would tie it into our newsletter and onto social media. And this is how we began justthefacts.vote. It was an incredibly effective tool to have everything in one place and serve really as a guidepost for accuracy. So what can you do as election officials? How can you combat misinformation? Honestly, I may not be the best person to tell you, but what I do know is you have to tell your story and tell it in a way that people can understand. We all need to do a better job about pulling down the curtains and providing more than just election dates and deadlines. We shouldn't just be sharing the nuts and bolts about elections. It's also about the human aspect. And I think that's something the last panel talked about quite effectively. In the elections department, we're not faceless bureaucrats. We live in our community and we hire thousands of poll workers that live in our community too. This year, our communication strategy is going to continue to focus on the facts in our justthefacts.vote, but we're also going to highlight the people and the people that work in the elections department and that support the elections in Maricopa County. And I just want to read one of the messages that are for our 2022 communications plan. An entire community of your friends and neighbors are working to ensure a secure, transparent, and accurate election in Maricopa County. Discover what it takes by visiting beballotready.vote. I'm committed to doing that, and I know others are too. And so I'm really hopeful and excited to be part of this conversation. So thank you so much, Tammy.
Absolutely. Great. Well, we've got a lot of questions that we're going to dive into, but first, Jen, I want to bring you in, and I would be remiss because pens have already come up, right? So we've got Sharpies, but we also, you were, I think, ascribed the nickname of Blue Pen Jen, and thank God you were in the Coliseum that day to see that people were using blue pens around ballots. And I know for every election official that heard that, it like made the hair on my neck stand up and my stomach kind of flip over, because anyone who knows elections knows that it's red and green pens, my friends, around marked official ballots. So talk us through what it was like from the local reporting side of things, and just what that process really felt like as a local reporter there in the Coliseum and in both those early days, and then also, since then, and how other reporters and other individuals who are perhaps listening in the audience, some of the things that they should be considering when they're approaching that sort of a situation.
Well, first, thank you so much, Tammy, for having me. I was excited when I heard that you guys were doing this because it's so important. It's such an important topic, especially since you said, many election offices have, one person to do everything. Communications has to be top of mind somehow. I don't know how you all do it, but that's for another day. And before I get going, I just wanted to say that I think one of the reasons I knew about the pens was because of Megan, because of Sharpiegate, because when that happened, I tried to learn as much as I could about ink on ballots, which is kind of like ironic that then that was what on the first day of the audit I noticed. So it was that like prior knowledge that I had going into an election process that helped me understand how it should work, which I think is just absolutely key for local reporters. So as you said, I'm working at VoteBeat now. I'm very excited to join their team. They're expanding across the country in many different states. So you're going to see a lot of VoteBeat local reporters reaching out to you soon. And I just encourage you to welcome them with open arms because we're really here to tell the truth, to learn what your job is as election administrators, and to figure out how to tell the story year round of elections, of all the work that goes into it, but also the truths, the struggles. And not everything in elections is perfect, so we'll be telling those stories too, but really get to having dedicated reporters on this full-time elections and voting. And so that's very exciting for me. So before the audit, I don't know if you heard Doug Logan, CEO of Cyber Ninjas, was very clear he only wanted friendly reporters to be there to witness this. That was something in his emails that we saw later. We didn't know that at the time, so we're just going about trying to get as much access as we can into the process so we can be there as witnesses, tell people how the ballots are being counted, see if this is a legitimate process. And that was our main, that's always, journalists' main goal, is to find the truth and to spread that. So we didn't really know how much difficulty we would have getting in. We were at first told you can't go in at all, and then you have to volunteer, which is how I got my shift on the first day. I was the only reporter to get that shift, which was terrifying for me, to be honest, because you are then the kind of the spokesperson for everyone who couldn't get in, including, county administrators weren't in there. So I was calling Megan on my breaks on that first day and trying to ask her, like, how do things go? I learned so much about the fact that you have to be initially prepared and understand how elections work when you get somewhere. Because if you don't really know what to look for. So I guess that is what I wanted to emphasize today, is that if you partner with local reporters and give them a tour of your office, show them where you count ballots, invite them to poll worker training, put out fact sheets ahead of your election on how things are going to work, develop one-pagers that explain certain processes, like this is how we verify signatures, this is how we count early ballots, this is when that process finishes. All the simple things that you do that you think are so normal that no one else really knows or understands. Ahead of time, if reporters know that going in, they're going to be so much better at getting the facts right on election day or in the days leading up to it. So I just wanted to emphasize that it's really a partnership. It was funny when this all started, the county had been so used to the Republic kind of picking apart elections for years. Everything that went wrong on election day, we were there to tell that story. And I remember in the 2018 election, even, it was all about, well, these polling places didn't open on time, and reporters are trying to learn about, who's the contractor, and all scramble around to figure out why they weren't opening on time. A very important story for our community. But then when this happened, it was kind of like I had someone at the county, not inside the county, but a politician say, we're so used to you guys being kind of, on the other side of things. And now it seems like you're really trying to find out the truth about elections. And that was comforting for me to hear, that it seemed like, well, I'm not going to be on the county side. It was relieving to hear that someone trusted that I wasn't going to try to tear them apart. I was just going to try to learn the truth of what happened. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. So this is going to be participatory. So everyone who's an election official that has received a phone call from a reporter on election day saying, "Where are all the lines? That's where I want to go. Please raise your hand." Okay. Yep. Pretty much every election official. So I think, that is the story, right? You want to have a line of voters behind you when you're pitching the story. And I do think that, the prior knowledge of how elections work is really, really critical. One of the things I've been saying for quite a while, it's become one of my mantras, is that you need to know what's right so you can tell what's wrong. So you knew it was right to have red and green pens, so you knew it was wrong to have blue pens. When there's a viral video circulating of votes being flipped in whatever the state is, if you know that that's not even the equipment they use in that state, it's pretty easy and quick to debunk certain things. So one of the things I wanted to kind of dig in here is that we've heard about the influential messengers and how that can be both positive and negative, right? Having your local official or a state official be a local messenger. But when you have these influential messengers that are in fact incentivized by the structure of closed primaries, or let's just say it for what it is, the coffers were lined in Arizona around not paying for what was happening. So we know that cost the taxpayers, but many politicians, both those that came to Arizona to get their pictures taken with the cyber ninjas and leveraged that back home on the campaign trail, there's a financial incentive there as well. And recently I was talking to a former state election official in Arizona, and so I have to attribute this to him, but I don't know if he really would want me to say his name. But what he was talking about is that all of this mis and disinformation is an energy that we need a lightning rod that connects it and grounds it and dissipates it when it's wrong and harmful and hurtful. And I keep coming back to that lightning rod. And so that's what Rusty Bowers did, with the bill. That is not what happened when that Cyber Ninja report was done and was handed back to the Senate. They didn't say, "This is done, close the deal." No, they passed it on to the Attorney General's office. So we need people to be the lightning rods for mis and disinformation and to ground it in reality and dissipate it. So here's the question that I often get from reporters and election officials, and it's, when you see that information that's out there, when do we engage and when do we leave it alone? Because when is engaging adding oxygen to the conversation and spreading it, or providing it a legitimacy of answering it? So I would like to talk about that for just a minute. Or, should we always try to correct falsehoods with the truth, no matter when, where, or who's speaking it? So I'm going to start off with you, Recorder Richard, and get your perspective on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a ill-defined, delicate balancing test that, when it starts getting so large, or depending on the speaker, it's maybe something that I should map out. Truthfully, it has more to do with how much sleep I've gotten the night before and my level of discipline. Yeah, but like I said, I think it depends on the speaker in particular, because certain speakers carry more weight. And if it comes from somebody with the trappings of authority, as Megan suggested, it can fly further than if it's just kitty cat 127 on Twitter or something like that. So that's probably where I direct my efforts. But this can be psychologically damaging to people in our office and people in this community. And so you have to draw some boxes around it. Otherwise, you're doing this 24/7. And there's the well never runs out. And you feel like the entire world is against you, when really you're just looking at a certain segment of the population, some of whom aren't even real human beings, because we know that there have been efforts by foreign actors to sow the seeds of discontent in American democracy by nation states. And so, I really, don't want Megan to be like, "I haven't slept for 3 months. but those Russian bots, they know not to mess with me now, sort of thing. So, I focus when it's, especially local politicians that I know of.
Great. And Megan, I feel like you should have an opportunity to jump in on that.
Well,
So when the recorder is tired and not disciplined, how does that affect your job?
well, I have to say it's a delicate balance because, we as election officials aren't just here to answer every piece of misinformation or every question that there is about elections. We actually have to run elections as well. And so it's a balance between trying to share the information that the public needs to know and still being able to do our jobs on a daily basis. And so for us, we take each piece and each claim to determine whether or not we feel like this is kind of a systemic thing, something that we really will be able to kind of tamp down, or is it just a wild, outlandish claim that we can just say, we don't know where those types of numbers are ridiculous. They're, what algorithm are they kind of talking about? We've proven time and time again that, the system in Maricopa County is free, fair, and accurate. The best pivot for me is pushing people back to the report that we did and the website. So that's a great place for people to continue to get that information. And so I don't think that there's a true line that says when it's like this or when this person says that. It's more about what can your office manage? How can you figure out how to balance responding to these types of things with your daily jobs? And I think that is something, a give and take and a push and pull, or how much you sleep or don't sleep the night before, that you really have to try and figure out for yourself in your office.
I think part of the challenge also is I've had people in the past saying, well, don't take it so personally. And they're like, oh, I am going to take everything personally because this is not just a job. For the vast majority of election professionals, it is their life's passion. And so it's always personal. Jen, I'd like to get your perspective on this. Some reporters that I've spoken to in the past have told me, I will always give it oxygen because particularly with inflammatory and incendiary headlines, because I get paid on clicks. And if I don't get X number of clicks on the online platform, my editor is all over me. And so I would love to get your perspective on that kind of notion from a reporter's vantage point of how the system, depending on where you're reporting, and how what the incentive structure is there sometimes for reporters, and whether or not you think that that's a healthy way of compensating journalists or not, or I'll let you just leave any of those things lie that you don't want to address and pick up the things that you're more interested in.
Thank you. So that is completely not how it worked at the Republic, and that's not going to be how it works at VoteBeat. At the Republic, we took so much, we spent so much time discussing what to cover and what not to cover for this very reason. Because if you do give it oxygen, that's it just spreads the lies further. And so there was a lot of debate, and that's what it takes. It takes thinking through, what Recorder Richer was saying about where is it coming from, how much traction does it have, and are we going to be able to effectively tell the story without spreading that lie? So there's this theory in journalism where if you make a mistake in a story, when you correct it, you don't repeat the mistake. You just say what's true. And so I guess the same theory applies here. If someone is, what is that, kitty cat is spreading a lie about ballots burning in a chicken fire, you think I'm making this up, but most of you probably know that that was actually one of the rumors. So is it just kitty cat saying this? And if it's not, if it's on a very, very, very well-read far-right website, how can we address this without repeating the chicken fire at all? We don't have to say the chicken fire didn't happen. We just have to say, this is how many early ballots the county got and counted, and they were tracked the whole time. So, it's about taking the lies and finding the truth in them, and then emphasizing that instead of focusing on the lie.
I like that. Leading with the truth is always important. And I'm going to direct the question back to you, Jen, and then we'll weigh in with everyone else. What do we do when the truth doesn't matter anymore? So, the reports come out, things are debunked, and yet they still get traction. And there's, of course, the Mark Twain quote that I always butcher about, the lie is going to make its way around the world a couple times before even the truth gets its shoes on. So what do we do in this situation when the truth isn't sufficient or isn't convincing? I think this ties into the first panel's conversation around the emotional aspect of it. I think that I've kind of built my career on having sound data and that the facts do matter and we need to have the facts, but how do we make that balance and tell the story well enough that we can ground it in facts and truth and still have that emotional kind of aspect to it?
Yeah, I think I'll let the other two speak a lot more on this because I don't know the answer. And it's something that I've thought about for, more than a year now. But I think that my approach has always been to inform the reasonable audience. And once I do that, feel comfortable with the fact that the reasonable people, the people that are going to be persuaded by facts, have all the information they need to tell the story to the people that don't. And so that's my job, is getting the truth out there and in the most effective way. Catering to people's emotions by using anecdotes or personal examples is always in journalism, something that reporters try to do in order to make stories resonate, but that really can go so far. So.
Great. Do the other two have you figured this out for us? Recorded.
No, I haven't figured it out by any stretch of the imagination with respect to the average consumer of media or the average retweeter. I'll just go back to the other two P's that I mentioned, the professionals and the politicians. With respect to the politicians, we have a state senator, Wendy Rogers, who's one of the largest progenitors of falsehoods in the country regarding the 2020 election. She came into our elections facility. She did a tour. She was very polite. She was very receptive. She got along well with all of our staff. And I would have liked to have said that we had a good relationship built in that 2-hour period. And she didn't challenge any of our processes. She even seemed to agree with them. 30 minutes later, her Twitter feeds, running off about, another, falsehood suggesting that, I don't know, the 2020 election should be decertified. I began this by saying I've been alarmed at how irrational mankind is, but in some ways, Wendy Rogers is the ultimate rational actor because she set fundraising records for the state legislature throughout the entire history of Arizona in 2021. And so, I guess in that instance, I would say you should signal to that person, hopefully, general Arizonans, that is an unacceptable means for trying to gain re-election. I won't vote for you, and I certainly won't donate to you. Now, I'm shouting into the wind right there because obviously Wendy's a more successful fundraiser than really just about anyone in the state, including yours truly. So yeah, I don't know. And then as far as professionals, Mark Brnovich, who's our attorney general, just put out this letter that is, complete errant nonsense. And the thing is he's not just a politician, he's also an attorney. And I think the legal community needs to step up and say, if we are to have any sort of, self-regulatory function, then that's simply something that you can't do. And that's embarrassing to the community. There's been a certain amount of that, but I would like to see more.
Great. Did you want to jump in, Megan?
I would say I would jump in on maybe the third P that the recorder Richard spoke about, the public, right? The general public. We're talking about the people that come and participate in the election once every 2 years. And how do we continue to communicate with them so they can be they can understand the election, they can participate in the election, and they can believe in the election. And so, I think it goes back to creating those connections, inviting the public into our spaces. One of the things that we're doing this year is partnering more with our community organizations that have deep roots in the community, bringing them in, letting them understand more about the election so they can help, kind of share our message back out with members of their community. In the last panel, they talked a lot about how to engage Latino voters, and they're such a huge and integral part of Maricopa County and the voters that we serve. And everything that we do is in English and Spanish. It must be, because they are such a big part of that. And so I think it's trying to find ways to involve your community in elections outside of the election cycle. How do they, what do they want to know? What does their community want to know? Maybe there's panels that you can speak on. Maybe there's groups that you can invite in to teach them about that. And those are the types of things that we're trying to figure out, and maybe others across the country are as well.
So you just answered question number 2 that was just handed to me, but I'm going to read it out loud because I want everyone who's watching and listening to hear what the question to pose, and think about how in your own office you're doing these things. And this came from Michelle with the League of Women Voters. Do you partner with groups like the League of Women Voters? We're a nonpartisan 501c group and can help you to educate and outreach to voters. We'd like to help our community of democracy nonprofits better surround and support our county election offices. So that's something to think about. And I think your answer kind of answered that one for us. We have a couple of more questions coming in. So from Pamela, who's the BPC elections campaign manager, she has a question for you, Megan. How do you define success in your comms strategy with so much beyond your control? So for example, the leader of the Republican Party continuing to spread mis and disinformation around the Maricopa County election and elections department.
That's a really great question. And I'm not sure it's one that I can answer fully. So let me answer it this way instead, which is such a communications thing to do. I think that the answer is participation in the election, is having voters come in and having your poll workers understand what's happening. I think that defines success. I think small actions of ensuring that the media knows that they can give you a call, that they can ask before printing. I think in this age of social media where you see a long line and you're like, oh, there must be something wrong there. Well, maybe first give us a call and then we'll let you know that there's a long line, but we have, this many people that are working on whatever that issue is. And so I think that it can be challenging to, have that like constant barrage of misinformation coming at us. But I truly believe that the work that we're doing as election officials is important and needs to be shared, and finding those partners to help us share it is critical to the success.
Great, thank you. This one is for Recorder Richer, and it's from Matthew. It says, what tools do you utilize to efficiently find and recognize disinformation on social media? Because I see you on social media quite a bit. I'm not gonna lie, I follow you. And it's always great. And so I'm curious, when you come across something, are you doom scrolling just like the rest of us are doom scrolling? Or are you doom scrolling with a purpose to identify certain things that you can hand off to Megan or to others? How do you do that effectively on a day-to-day basis without going?
No, I'm sure we utilize tools. Megan could speak to those tools, but I'm just a psycho without much of a life, without too many hobbies. And so I pay attention to a lot of this stuff, and I do it while watching basketball, watching the NBA playoffs at night too. And so, my tweets will be interspersed with commentary on how it's alarming that Devin Booker is out for the next 2 games. But meanwhile, that's inaccurate information about the 2020 election. So no, I don't. Yes, there are a myriad of tools. I should probably be better about utilizing them in my personal capacity. But the office does utilize all the sort of analytics, the Hootsuites of the world. But I'm by no means a specialist.
I would disagree, Recorder. And this is why, is that I think that people can you might not be able to recognize that you're seeing disinformation or misinformation, but the way that you can counteract that is to follow the trusted sources. And you are a trusted source. And so when, the community should be following the county officials, the Secretary of State's office, whoever is the organizations that do truly know how elections work and how they operate. And that's how you can combat it. You combat it through the right voices who know what's happening on the ground.
And Jen, how about you? What do you decide needs to be fact checked and what is just in fact kitty cat 734?
I guess if it is a troll and I know they're a troll, I don't engage. That's like my rule. I don't, sometimes they get me and I, in a moment of weakness, will respond and just give the facts again. But I think it is hardest when it becomes personal online and on Twitter, and it did over the course of the year, the last year for me many times. And so just learning to step away and say that this person isn't trying to engage in a meaningful conversation. And if you don't engage, then they're going to get less attention, was kind of my rule. I know some reporters do take a different approach, and I don't know what's correct, but it helped me maintain my sanity. That's all that mattered to me.
Yep, we all have to find those things. And we're gonna wrap up. I've got a lightning round, one last question and this comes from Kim, on whether or not you have any advice on how local election officials can best deal with the onslaught of public records requests. So oftentimes they're totally legitimate from reporters. A FOIA is a great transparency channel, but we do know that there's a concerted effort. It's practically denial of service attacks at this point on offices with FOIA requests. So we'll just do a quick lightning round. If you have any suggestions, we'll start with you, Jen. You deal with a lot of FOIA requests. Sometimes it takes a very long time to get information, but now in light of what's happening, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I'm really glad this got brought up. So basically, if you're an administrator and you have zero time for this, which I understand, call the reporter and ask them exactly what they're looking for right away. Say, you put in this really super broad request and it's going to take a few years, legitimately a few years to get it. What do you need? What are you looking for? Reporters get defensive if you ask them, what's the story? Because oftentimes reporters don't really know what the story is until they get the records. But just be friendly, be nice. I want to be helpful. And the reporter's going to really appreciate that, that you know that they're a human just looking for information.
Great. Recorder Richard?
It's been a challenge for our office, but I'm proud of where we're at. We respond to the average public records request within a week, but we've been swamped. We've gone from an office that maybe in 2015 got 86 public records requests a year to we got 86 public records requests in March of this year. So we in 2021 had hundreds. Many of them were produce everything related to elections for the past 2 years. And it's like, okay, well, yeah. So first step, reach out to the person who made the request. Just as Jen said, oftentimes they just don't know exactly what they're looking for, but by talking it through, and especially with responsible requesters like Jen, you can sort of get a sense of what would be the key terms to search. Second, if it's somebody who's there for antagonistic purposes and just harass you, speak with whoever your attorney representation is as the elections department and say, most case law and statutes have some sort of can't be unduly burdensome type narrowing focus. So you can't be produce everything and every single thing ever for the eternity, for all eternity sort of thing. So we can narrow that. And if it's overly broad, then you can, maybe you don't have to statutorily respond to it. And then the third thing is be organized, because so much of this stuff is asked for multiple times, such that you don't want to be recreating the wheel every single time. So have all the records requests that you've responded to before listed, outlined, such that if one comes in and it's 9/10 the same, well, you don't have to redo that work at least. And then, we're lucky that we have a rock star who's a designated person to corral people. And then leadership, I guess the last part would leadership has to let people know that it is a priority, because it's easy to put on the back burner as this is the last thing I want to have to deal with is going through my emails from the past 3 months when we have things going on. But no, I need you to work on that. And we need to respond as responsible stewards of public records.
Great, thank you.
I feel like that's a little bit unfair that Recorder Richard got to go before me, since the Recorder's Office is who manages our public records requests. But one thing I will say is, the system is so incredibly important, is to have the process and the system in place to be able to intake those. Like the recorder said, to be able to have a place where you can always go back. If everyone's requesting kind of very similar things, you can always go back and pull the information that you've provided previously. Work with your county attorney, with whoever your, person is, to make sure that those overly broad requests could be narrowed down, and that you can do that. And then I totally agree with Jen on reporters. Sometimes they are asking for it because they want to kind of see what's in there, or what could potentially be there. And so sometimes they're on deadline and they don't really need everything that they asked for. And by being honest with them that request is going to take us a week, it's going to take us a month, it's going to take us 2 months, that will help them better decide, well, okay, go forward with that. And then you prioritize, or they can kind of tailor it to something else, or I can provide them one document and that's exactly what they were looking for. So it's those 3 steps.
Great. Well, thank you for the 3 of you for joining us today for this conversation. I knew it would fly by, and it's great to see you all.
Important thing that the Arizona Secretary of State's office did that's worth highlighting here was our efforts to ensure that nonpartisan expert observers had access to the counting floor, and that those people could provide regular press briefings about what they saw and how it compared to election audit best practices. So this was critical for helping to both pre-bunk and debunk the mis and disinformation that we knew would come from the Cyber Ninjas exercise. I'll note that given the lack of transparency and the known departures from best practices in terms of actually conducting an election audit, we really struggled at the Secretary of State's office in the early stages of this as to whether we wanted to have any SOS affiliated observers there at all, because we didn't want to legitimize the exercise by having our people there. But because the expert observers weren't granted access on their own and we had to litigate to get that access, we decided ultimately that it was better to have experts there who could speak credibly to the processes being used from their own firsthand experience from being there on the ground, rather than having no one there at all. And looking back now, I think that was definitely the right call. Early on, we tapped into the deep network of national election audit experts, sharing our concerns and developing relationships with them and keeping them up to speed on what was going on and how we may be able to use their help as the circumstances evolve really rapidly on the ground. I just can't stress enough how thankful we are at the Secretary of State's office to Jennifer Morrell of the Elections Group, who was one of the Secretary's designated experts, Ryan Macias and Liz Howard from the Brennan Center. Not only were they willing to jump on a plane on short notice, get to Arizona, and be there on the ground, they were diligent throughout the process in providing expert feedback on what they were seeing, keeping the media informed on what they were seeing and how that compared to best practices. And if we hadn't done that legwork to develop those relationships before the audit really took off, we wouldn't have been able to mount the response that we did to all the misinformation that came out of that. So it was critical to us that voters and the public have this insight and information from these credible experts on the review so that they could make informed decisions about the processes that were being deployed and whether what came out of this process was credible or not. So thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everyone who supported the Secretary of State's office in that process.
Thank you, Bo. Now I'm going to go to Karen Brinson Bell of North Carolina. I'd love for you to introduce yourself. And I would also love for you to talk about the voter confidence campaign that the North Carolina State Board of Elections put on with, I think, great effect. I was really interested and jazzed to see that roll out.
Thank you. We're pretty proud of it ourselves. Yes, I'm Karen Brinson Bell. I'm the executive director of the North Carolina State Board of Elections. And I also serve as the chief elections official for North Carolina because we are an independent agency. I'm a full-time elections administrator who reports to an appointed bipartisan board and who are not full-time election administrators. They have other jobs and other roles in their worlds. So they serve in a quasi-judicial sort of framework. And at the county level, where I was previously a county elections director, the county boards also are sort of independent bodies because they work full-time with the direction of a bipartisan elections board. So I've been in elections since 2006. And when I came on as state elections director in June 2019, we at that point, obviously, as the elections profession, had been designated as critical infrastructure. And we knew that some questions had been raised, misunderstanding about how e-poll books work. And we were also in the process of, by state law, DREs were being decertified. And so we needed to certify new voting equipment before a Super Tuesday primary in 2020. So, looking at less than a 6-month turnaround to do that for about a third of our state, including one of our most populous counties. Mm-hmm. We got together and decided we needed to launch a voter confidence campaign. We did not have a crystal ball of what all would be happening in 2020. It was really focused on helping folks understand the critical infrastructure nature of elections and how we secure our elections. And around that campaign, we wanted folks to know the partnerships that we have with Homeland Security, with emergency management, with the North Carolina National Guard Cyber Unit, with North Carolina Department of Information Technology, our law enforcement officers, you name it, the partnerships that were coming about and how we were working with all 100 county boards of elections in North Carolina to be united in our efforts. And we came through that process. We came up with the hashtag #YourVoteCountsNC. And again, no crystal ball, but how perfect that wound up being to carry us through 2020 and even today. And so we launched that campaign and started telling our story. That's what we knew we needed to do so that people could understand that we don't work behind a curtain and it's not smoke and mirrors, that there are processes in place that have been in place and how methodical we are in ensuring that every vote counts. And from that, we have developed top 10 lists, facts that people can know about how we secure elections. We keep that updated so that they know how we're in continuous improvement to make the processes better for everyone. We started doing a social media campaign that fortunately has increase the number of followers that we have. I know that came up in a previous panel of you can't just have a social media site or page, you've got to have followers and who are retweet and reshare, and we've managed to do that. And we do that every single day. We have something out on social media, be it Mythbusters Monday or Fun Fact Friday or trivia or Elections 101. I mean, we've got an entire campaign as such built out so that people understand, be it that their poll worker is their former teacher or coach, and we profile those folks, or be it that they need to understand that modems are not allowed by law in North Carolina, and make that fact known so that this disinformation that's out there, that we're combating it. And that has carried over even to our website. We revamped our website in 2020 to be more user-friendly and more secure. And we also have one of the largest outlets for election data that I think we have in our entire nation. And we've done that while including a data communications specialist at our agency. And that group, our communications team, who are just phenomenal, they created a combating misinformation page so that all the reports and the data that we analyze Those fact sheets and those reports are always accessible to the public. Once again, just reinforcing the transparency that we want people to know about.
And just a quick personal note, and in my capacity as a data journalism professor, I frequently used your data in my classes. So shout out for that. Thank you.
Sorry if we made life harder on other states.
You make life easier for me.
Well, good.
And this seems like a very proactive approach. And I wonder if you have noticed a difference in the way that the media covers you now that more information is out there that they just have at their fingertips. Are you getting fewer dumb questions that are a waste of your time on election day, or is that just a perennial issue?
I think it definitely has helped us build our relationships out with the media. It's also helped our counties be able to respond effectively. I mean, we have 2 counties that are close to 1 million voters, and then we have counties as small as 2,500 registered voters and 1-person offices. So they wear so many hats that being a comms specialist is not something that they can do. So it has helped inform the political parties. It's helped inform the media. What we hope is that it's helping to inform the public. We are seeing certainly our data shows that we've seen an uptick in public records requests and data requests. I know Recorder Richard was talking about the number of requests that Maricopa County gets, but in 2021, we had over 750 data requests. That's not even our public records requests, which were similarly on par. And already this year, in the first quarter, if we continue to track the way that we are, we will have over 800 data requests this year. So it does help with the relationships with the media. And we also have set press releases and things that we put out in media kits and so forth, so that they can easily communicate to the public as well. But I'm not sure the difficulty is reaching that person who's misinformed or uninformed and making sure that they get that information.
Thank you. And I'd like to return to you, Bo. I know, so I'm going to ask both of you this question. The only unacceptable answer is nothing. If you could do this over again, what would you do differently? If you had, Lord help me, if 2020 started over, how would you change your communication and public engagement strategy?
So I've honestly given this quite a bit of thought as to what I would do differently if I could do 2020 again. And like Jessica, I want to be clear that I never want to do 2020 over again in case fate is listening. But if I could, and if I had to, I don't know that there's anything I would or could have done differently within the constraints of what we were operating in then in 2020. Like other states, we faced the unprecedented challenges of the pandemic, the levels of misinformation, threats to election officials, et cetera. But I would say even more so than many other states. In Arizona, the Arizona Secretary of State's office was extremely understaffed and underfunded and under attack politically and otherwise in Arizona. But we managed to deliver for Arizonans 3 free, fair, secure, smooth, and successful elections. And I'm incredibly proud of that. But if I could lift some of the constraints that we were operating under in 2020, if we had the resources and the legislative authorization, I think high on my list operationally would have been to be able to conduct statewide risk limiting audits. Arizona already has post-election hand count audit of election day and early ballots, but the way the statute is currently, the county doesn't conduct it if the parties don't participate, and the audit that is required limits kind of the flexibility and efficacy of the audit. But and it's probably wishful thinking to think that something like that, doing risk limiting audits in 2020, would have fended off the Cyber Ninjas debacle, but it certainly wouldn't have. But I think it would have given us yet one more tool to point to in assuring our voters that the results of our elections are accurate. And while Arizona has robust election security and integrity procedures in place, there's always room for improvement, and we're always looking for that. And then, of course, if we had unlimited time and resources without the constraints of COVID, I wish we could have done more outreach to voters via town halls and events within the communities and meeting voters where they are, kind of the themes we've heard in the prior two panels, identifying those trusted messengers within the communities where it's hard to penetrate and get messages across, and especially to reach voters in tribal and rural areas and those needing voting information in minority languages. But I think with that said, a takeaway for me from 2020 and 2021 that I think everyone here will relate to is that, we can't fight bad information by just putting out more good information. It's incumbent upon election officials to nowadays to do that. As we've said, comms departments have become critical. But in this environment, that's just the starting point, and it can't be the end point. And just simply elevating truthful content just isn't enough to undo or even begin to stem the damage of the disinformation that's out there. There's just this incentive system that's in place that manufactures this broken information environment that we have to operate in. And I think that's kind of a whole of society and whole of government problem that has to be solved. And we need our leaders at the state and federal level to get on that. But in the meantime, election officials will continue to do what we do, which is a whole lot with very little to get information out to our voters.
Thank you. And I believe that Secretary Benson from Michigan is joining us. Will she be popping up? Well, while that's happening, I'm going to go to you. What would you do differently?
Well, you can slap my hand for saying nothing, but I'm going to stick with that, because I am going to proclaim, just as I did the day after our election, it is the most successful election North Carolina has ever had. And I stand proud by that. I stand proud by those folks who worked tirelessly and the number of hours that they put in. And we've got the facts to prove that. We had the highest voter turnout ever in North Carolina. We had a report that we didn't even know was going to come out from the Department of Health and Human Services that said there was no link to COVID. There was no COVID spread linked to voting. How can you say that that's something you would change? That is a huge accomplishment. We delivered voting to more absentee by mail voters than we've ever done, while also seeing the largest use of our early voting, in-person voting ever. And so when I look at that, we actually had a theme with our conferences going into the elections that centered around the infamous North Carolina State cardiac pack and how they cut down the nets in practice and to prepare for that victory, and how they went through a survive and advance. And we had one of the celebrated players from that team, Derek Wittenberg, to talk to our folks. And so I promised them, I was like, we pulled this off and we're going to have our one shining moment. And we have a montage that celebrates that. So again, I wouldn't do it any differently. And I want folks to start realizing that all the naysayers and all the people who are questioning what we did need to look back and recognize what we did make happen. It doesn't mean that we stopped doing a continuous improvement. It doesn't mean that we didn't do lessons learned, but it's amazing. We conducted elections while voting was going on, and there were ransomware attacks in county government. We kept it going, and we had no issues with election security in a pandemic as well. So I'm going to say nothing, but I'm going to celebrate what we did.
I'll let you have it. Secretary Benson, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to ask you a little bit of a combo question to get you up to speed in the panel. I'd love for you to introduce yourself and then also discuss your Ready for November video series that you did. And then I'm going to have you kind of append on the end of that lessons learned from 2020, what you might do differently if you were forced to do it again, which we hope never happens.
Well, yeah, I mean, I second everything my colleague from North Carolina just said. I think she laid it out beautifully. I mean, we actually had an enormously successful election on every metric, as she just so eloquently, in a data-driven, fact-based way, laid out for everyone. So it's basically ditto in Michigan. We actually, just followed the data and made smart, informed decisions, talking with my colleagues all around the country to, it's one of the reasons why all of us on both sides of the aisle in many states sent out absentee ballot request forms, because in this was an election in which citizens needed to know they had a safe and secure option to vote from home in the midst of a pandemic. And myself and other secretaries of state, Democrats and Republicans, talked about this. A significant number of us on both sides of the aisle did just that and did it securely. I think what was unfortunate was that what was unfortunate, but also what we knew was going to happen, was that all of our work hit at a time when there was this similar unprecedented effort to overturn the results of the election, and prior to Election Day, really try to undermine people's faith in the process and set the stage for the potential need to challenge election results, which we also lived through on the other side of the election. But what was remarkable in particular about the 2020 election is that every step of the way, because we had so many partners, because we were all across the country dealing with a lot of the same challenges, and we were all collaborating at the state and federal level as well with CISA more effectively than ever before, we were able to actually have an incredibly successful, smooth election that was so important, because in some states where it was close and in other states where it wasn't, we all had to protect the results. We all had to stand up against efforts to undermine the results, even though we audits and through many other ways, the accuracy of the results stood and was evident for anyone willing to look at the facts. And the last thing I'll say, Jessica, is in regards to the Ready for November series, that was our effort to get ahead of what we knew would be an onslaught of misinformation about our elections, and to provide a series where we knew one of the best antidotes to countering misinformation was educating voters on the front end so that they could spot the lie because they already knew the truth. And then secondly, doing that with trusted messengers. So we partnered with sports leaders, we partnered with business leaders, we partnered with community organizations, faith leaders and others, and election officials to amplify their work at the local level, to simply just provide that data point for anyone with questions about our elections to know all the work that was going into it, and to provide also content for media outlets that were covering preparations for November. The challenge was actually then making sure that content was connected to people and making sure people actually heard it. And that was particularly challenging in the midst of the pandemic. But a lot of the work we did on the front end to educate voters about their rights, about their options to vote, and about their secure and safe way in which we validate ballots and count every valid vote helped us withstand enough of the pressure that was placed on voters and many officials to overturn or block the certification of election results, and ultimately get through that really tumultuous time with our election results intact. That hasn't stopped the attacks, which I'm sure we'll talk about, or have talked about, but they've only really escalated and increased in sophistication since that time. But it's important to note that we came together in 2020, had a successful election on every front possible, and also were able to shore up our security so much that we were able to withstand really an unprecedented, multifaceted, and strategic effort to undermine those elections and those results once they didn't go the way that some people wanted them to.
Thank you. I would like to talk a little bit about sort of proactive efforts to combat misinformation. We've touched on that a little bit, but I'd love to have Bo talk first about the importance of coordinating between counties. Of course, Arizona only has 9. I know 15. That 15. Oh, I'm sorry, 15. And you have 100. Am I correct? So maybe it's a little bit different for the both of you. So I'd like to hear kind of the difference between that sort of model, but let's start with you. Why was it important to coordinate between counties, and what tools did you use to do that?
Mm-hmm. So as many other states did, in Arizona, we really leaned into the Trusted Info campaign that was coordinated by the National Association of Secretaries of State to promote election officials as the trusted sources of election information. So we used our social media and every other opportunity to spotlight state and county election officials and to help drive voters directly to their local election officials for the most accurate information about how elections were going to be run in their communities. So alongside that effort to highlight state and local election officials as the credible, verified sources for election information. We also learned the importance of communication between those officials themselves and not just from the officials to the voters, and coordinating messaging from state and local officials about specific instances of mis and disinformation as they arise. If we're telling people to turn to their state and local election officials for trusted information, when a piece of disinformation really takes hold, it just throws fuel on the fire for those officials to be saying different things. Even if they're not really saying different things, but it's just framed differently, it can just throw fuel on that fire of disinformation. So the counties in Arizona, we have 15, thank goodness, but they're very diverse. Maricopa County, who you just heard from, is the second largest voting jurisdiction in the country, while our smallest counties have just a couple thousand registered voters. So their internal comms resources and capacities vary correspondingly. And cognizant of that, the Secretary of State's office really made an effort to offer comms support to, especially to our smaller counties whenever they needed it, and to promptly communicate with comms staff at all of our counties, especially the larger counties with more developed comms departments when issues arise. We helped our counties. I think Pam mentioned earlier that only about 30% of elections offices have social media handles. We helped our counties set that up that didn't have them, and those that did, we helped them get the verified check so they could have an additional imprimatur of authority and as a trusted source. We also started shortly after 2020 hosting these hour-long monthly comms calls for state and local officials. So our office, the Citizens Clean Elections Commission, which is a unique thing in Arizona that does public financing for candidates, but also is tasked with educating voters about elections. So we pulled Clean Elections in, and then all of the county recorders and elections departments, as well as their comms staff, if they have it. And the purpose of these calls was really simple, and this was in addition to all the other coordination in terms of operations with our counties. So we have weekly and biweekly calls with the counties on general election operations, but this was specifically dedicated to comms and misinformation and disinformation. And the purpose of these calls was simply so that we could share information and get feedback and coordinate when needed in response to mis and disinformation that's emerging. So, heads up, the Secretary of State's office is getting lots of calls about this issue, or this county is hearing a lot of this. And what are other counties hearing it too? What's the most effective way to respond? Is this an issue where a response from the Secretary of State's office would be the most effective? Or is this an issue where the local jurisdiction, the county taking the lead, would be more effective? And how can we coordinate that and be as in sync with each other as we can? So I think these calls, generally on the operational calls, there's some butting of heads and tensions, but on the comms call, it's just been uniformly positively received, incredibly well intended and engaged, and our counties appreciate that. And we would highly recommend it, carving out the time for something like that for states that aren't already doing it.
And how does a state like North Carolina with 100 counties do something like that? Do you?
We do, and there's some similarities, and yet we don't have a playbook for this. We're all learning as we go, I think, is the reality. But I think one of the things we've tried to establish is we even call ourselves Team 101. 100 county boards of elections, one state board of election, working in a collaborative, concerted effort to deliver elections to all eligible voters in North Carolina. We share best practices. We share our communication tools. And we know that the state board's there to support what's happening on the front lines with the counties, because they're the ones who count the ballots. They're the ones who deliver the voting. They're the ones who find those bipartisan officials to work those dusk to dawn or dawn to dusk days. And so we have as well, we've done training opportunities every other week. We have specific training for the county officials. Sometimes it has folks from CISA talking about phishing and how to spot phishing attempts. Sometimes it's a county sharing a best practice of how they've established, a special training program for their poll workers or something of that nature. We call them huddles. So there's that team theme, but it's real. And it is how we get those current information to them that might need emphasis beyond a numbered memo going out or an email going out. And then once voting does start, in-person voting will Monday morning, 8:30, we'll rally together for a stand up that we call Monday morning kickoffs, so that they know, in a 15-minute window, what's the most urgent, what's the most pressing. And, and sometimes it is, this is the bit of misinformation that's going around right now. This is what we're going to all face. You're probably going to hear from your local media, or we might hear from national media. North Carolina being the 9th most populous state and very purple, and purple before we knew what purple was, means that we do get a lot of attention. And so having that coordinated work approach in our state is really key.
Thank you. And Secretary Brinson, I'd love to hear from you about how you manage to coordinate the counties, and it's really not a county issue in Michigan, is it? You've got lots of clerks, and I'd love to hear how you coordinate messaging between them. And I'd also love to hear about the misinformation email address that the Secretary of State set up, that I understand fueled the fact-checking page and maybe influence some of your communication strategy.
On the second point, the misinformation@michigan.gov email gave something memorable and actionable that people could do, something they could take to be empowered to fight misinformation. And that was indeed how we found out about many false robocalls, many specific targeted efforts to confuse voters about their rights or about their options to vote in the lead up to Election Day. And it also enabled us to rapidly respond to them, both by posting something on our website, putting out a release, engaging the Attorney General's office, whatever we needed to do to effectively debunk that misinformation in partnership with the folks on the ground who were receiving it. And in Michigan, we have 83 clerks or 83 counties. So we have 83 county clerks, and then we have about 1,500 local city and township clerks within those counties. The county clerks handle kind of the ballot production, and then they receive the ballots, and the town, in some cases, but in all cases, they receive the results and are charged with communicating them out at the county level. And then at the local level, for the most part, townships and communities actually handle the administration part. And so that's a long established decentralized program in our state, and the clerks themselves have an extraordinary network that they know in order to succeed, they work together. And so our office and the Bureau of Elections within my office simply just plugs into that network and that community and partners with their leadership to make sure we are all aligned. And it's a great thing, because these are folks from both sides of the aisle who are simply, just as election officials are, committed to the work and committed to ensuring elections work for everyone. So we, through proactive communication, which we're actually increasing even more now for this cycle, we were able to partner with them and make sure, in particular, that they had the resources they needed to really meet the moment and deliver a secure and highly accessible election and efficiently tabulate every valid vote in light of all the pressure that all of them are under. Now, of course, then it's actually just up north in Antrim County yesterday, where a long case got dismissed and booted out of court by a judge there, challenging the results. But that shows how in a decentralized system like that, bad actors can just seize on one example of human error and metastasize it to make it a national story, but also a national plug to, or sword to try to justify further misinformation, overturning of election results. So all that's to say is, clearly all the communication still can't, when you have a decentralized system, stop the misuse and abuse in very rare circumstances by outsiders, which is really kind of the new front of what we're working to really embolden and protect our clerks from the pressure that they're receiving from many outsiders who want access to their equipment or other things to further their own partisan agendas. And our clerks remain steadfast, but still, when you have such a broad community, that support, communication, and connectivity is key.
Thank you. I would like to, we have about 7 minutes. So I'd like to turn it over to an audience question. This is from Will Adler at the Center for Democracy and Technology. And he wants to know if Secretary of State's offices have a particular way to communicate with the social media platforms themselves when a particular narrative piece of misinformation is being spun into chaos. We hear a lot about having a positive communication strategies, but what about flagging narratives directly to the platform so that content can be labeled or de-amplified? And if such a channel doesn't exist, would you want one? Let's start with you, Belle.
So such a channel does exist. We at the Arizona Secretary of State's office had a direct contact at the major social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, through which we could flag pieces of misinformation and inaccurate information about elections. And I think like our comms director could probably speak more specifically to instances, but overall, like our office was pretty pleased with how that flow of information worked in 2020.
Great.
Yeah, it's similar to what Bo said. We do work directly with the platforms. I think that relationship can be built out better because there's still disinformation that we at times requested to be taken down that we didn't see eye to eye on. But we did have some occasions where we worked with those outlets and did have some things removed because they were outright lies and misrepresenting actually the state, or excuse me, a county board of elections. So that certainly couldn't happen either. It was a false page. So there are efforts. It's still not a perfected thing. We could have someone sit and scroll through these platforms all day long and they still wouldn't get up through all of it trying to deal with misinformation. But it's better than it could be.
Feel so hopeful.
It has been, yes.
Secretary Brinson, how has your relationship with these platforms been?
Yeah, we've been very proactive at developing a connection with everywhere from LinkedIn and YouTube to Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, because it's critical. And the government relations folks at those various entities have been helpful. And I think we have to really look at the moment that we're in as emerging out of a trying time, but heading into a more trying time. And so the question is, what can we do better that we didn't do as effectively as possible in 2020? And because social media has only become an increasingly, and if Musk buys Twitter, even more so, a space for misinformation to flourish. We need to, I think, be more serious about, as trusted sources of information, partnering with them, just as we partner with many in the media, to ensure they are doing what they can to help us inform the electorate as opposed to misinform.
Thank you. And we have just a couple of minutes left, and I think I'd like to sort of connect all of these dots back to the safety and security of your local election officials and poll workers. And so all of this misinformation doesn't just exist on the internet. It rears its head in real life, and I think in very real ways has risked the safety of your folks. And I'd love to know what steps you're taking ahead of the midterms to shore that up and to help your local officials feel more supported and safe in their jobs. Karen, would you like to kick it off?
I mean, we've had a constant partnership with our emergency management and public safety division, but we have also spent a lot of time this past year trying to foster stronger relationships with our Sheriff's Association and with the Chief of Police Association. We've also been working to look at a technology tool that will help us track and connect the dots between instigators on social media and the people who actually send the hate mail or make the denial of service phone calls to shut down our operations and make accusations that are on the verge of threats if they're not. And so those are the things we're trying to do. We're not there yet. This wasn't where we expected to be. But those partnerships are what have been really crucial, and making sure that those partners understand how elections operate has been really important, because it's interesting when you start looking at your state laws and they aren't election specific, or if they are, that law enforcement doesn't deal with that every day, and making sure that we can be on a coordinated front.
Thank you. Secretary Brinson.
Yeah, and similarly, as to what Karen was talking about, it's really, in my view, two fronts. One, strengthening the legislation in our state, strengthening the protections so that it is so that we're taking these threats against election officials as threats against democracy and dealing with them more seriously. And then secondly, it is the connectivity, whether it's with the Justice Department and the FBI, which we actively partner with, or having conversations with local election officials and their local law enforcement, which is key, the latter of which we're really leaning in on this year for this cycle. That's what it's going to take, because we want to know that in every community in Michigan, if something goes wrong on election day, if there is a threat, if there is violence, that they know exactly who to call and have built that relationship ahead of time. And then similarly, if they are personally threatened, that they also know who they can call and who will be there for them. And so the Justice Department has been very helpful at building and encouraging and incentivizing those relationships and those connections. And we are going to be hosting a meeting next month with local clerks and local law enforcement to begin that conversation about how we can build that connectivity, not just for this year, but for 24 as well.
Thank you. And Bo, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, I just echo what Karen and Secretary Benson said, that it's critical to engage all the partners that have to help support election administration, and bringing in law enforcement and enforcement offices and other agencies in government that can support those efforts to keep election workers safe. So I think in 2020, there was a lot of focus on building those partnerships in order to be prepared for potential interruptions and voter intimidation at the polls. And now with the increase in threats against election officials, we're kind of continuing to build those partnerships and relationships and lines of communication, but now also with a focus towards protecting the safety of the people who make elections and democracy happen.
And in your new role, what I understand you're going to be providing legal support to elections officials. Will part of that be supporting them if they feel threatened or have legal actions taken against them?
So States United actually has a focus on preventing political violence, and that program is deeply focused on supporting state and local election officials in responding to the increased threat in this environment of threats and harassment that confronts them, including monitoring social media for trends, working on training resources for election officials, etc. So yes, I'm thrilled to continue to be able to do that work.
What a great tool. Thank you. Well, that concludes our panel on state innovations. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so let's jump right in, because we don't have a ton of time on this panel. And I wanted to start, the title of the panel is The Role of Communications in Administration of Elections and a Healthy Democracy. So we're hoping to really kind of sum up, in a way, a lot of what we've already talked about today, and leave those of you who are watching, especially election administrators, with some practical tips and takeaways that you can leave the conference with. So that's our goal, but also we just want to hear about the interesting experiences of our panelists as well. So I wanted to start with Jennifer, actually. I know that, election officials have always understood educating voters about the process of voting, like where's your polling place? How do you, do you have to get a witness to, sign your absentee ballot, all of that. That's always been understood to be a kind of core part of the job and part of the job duties. But now we've definitely transitioned to an environment in which educating voters is also about heading off misconceptions and misinformation in this really challenging environment that we've talked about. So I was wondering what your thoughts are, because I know you've also been working on some of these toolkits. What are your thoughts on how election officials who are maybe in smaller jurisdictions than Maricopa County and don't have a full communications department in their budget, are there ways that they can sort of leverage the communications expertise of other election officials and other larger jurisdictions across the country as they're seeking to educate their voters in this environment of disinformation?
Yeah, thanks, Gowrie. It's great to be here. And I'll just take a quick second. I want to thank Larry and his staff and my co-conspirators and the Humphrey School for hosting this. This has just been a phenomenal event. Thanks to all of you that have stuck with us online for 3 hours. I hope that this is a useful conference. I certainly have taken a lot out of it. So similarly to security measures, there's no one single measure that ensures the security and integrity of our elections. We know that we do that through multiple layers of safeguards and security mechanisms that we put in place. Similarly with communications, there's no silver bullet to win the hearts and minds of those who may be critical about the work that we're doing. However, I want to just take a step back when we think about things that any office can do regardless of their resources. And I recognize that the biggest deficit in resource is staffing, right? Often we end up working at the elections group with offices staffed with 4 people that in reality need 8 or 10 to carry out the work that they do. But I actually recommend taking a step back. Every office should focus first on having documented written procedures. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, it ensures that your operations happen correctly. It ensures that you retain that knowledge of individuals. But it also helps you when you start to think about crisis communications or response or building some of these secure communication tools that we've heard about. So I'd encourage people to start with those critical elements. Any operational process where your chain of custody logs and forms are involved, your tests, your audits, and document those so that you have that sort of step-by-step look at how those things work and you can articulate that comfortably. At the elections group, we've created some of those for you, and we'll have some more coming out here shortly that can help provide a foundation for writing those. But once you've been able to do that, then you can take those long SOPs and sort of distill them down into talking points, into posters, into handouts, into informational flyers that we have seen be very, very useful out in the field. The EAC just released a great toolkit with a template for those signs and posters. They developed that in coordination with our friends at the Center for Civic Design, using tools that we've seen and posters and things that we've seen actually have a real impact, and that's free and available for anybody to use. Once you've got those resources, then as you've heard echoed across all the other panels today, you can tap into sort of building your community of advocates, those poll workers, civic groups, superstars in your community, the members of the media who will get that information out for you. And that's so important. I can't overstress how effective just bringing people into your election office. And I saw this both when I was an election administrator and also in the jurisdictions I've supported, bringing those groups, media members, critics, others into your facility and educating them about the process. Make the time for that. And that's something anybody can do regardless of resources. You've heard a lot about telling your story. And I think that's where, when we talk about comms resources, that becomes challenging. We know that videos are effective. We know op-eds go a long way, and some of the social media work that's been done. You heard Pam mention earlier, the elections group's putting a guide out here in a few weeks. What I love about the work Pam's done on this guide is it's not just her good ideas or our good ideas, but it's this collection of things that have worked in states and jurisdictions across the country that folks can copy and emulate. So that's a good resource. 2 other things real quick. You heard earlier some talk about knowing what's being said and tapping into those analytical tools. You actually have a resource in your office, and that's the individuals that take phone calls and answer emails from voters. They're probably the best source. Definitely you want to set up the Google alerts, that's helpful, but talking to those folks on a daily basis can give you a really good sense of misinformation or things that are spreading within the myths that are spreading within the community. And then you're armed with your procedures, you've got the posters, you've got your social outreach, you know what's being said. Last thing is just being prepared for that crisis moment. There's some good resources around rumor control. CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is always a mouthful, started a rumor control page. Anybody can copy that. You heard from Maricopa, they're just the facts is excellent. So there's a lot of resources, even in an office that doesn't have that communications experience, that can be used and tapped into. I'll just end by saying, I think Tammy said it earlier, communications is absolutely critical in every office of any size. And so we've got to work to get those resources available in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And that was a lot of really great practical tips, actually. So I thought that was super helpful. And I love the idea of sort of using almost the folks who have to man the phone lines as a kind of helpful source of monitoring what's going on, especially locally in your community. I wanted to bring in Avery now and talk about the fact that in addition to educating voters, and we've heard a lot about it today, election officials have to just communicate with the public generally. So that would include non-voters, people from outside the jurisdiction, right? And crucially, observers. And in particular, there's now this new set of observers who may not have been interested in the process previously and who may be coming to the process with really complicated or even, deeply built-in preconceptions by the time they show up to observe your election procedures. So I first wanted to ask Avery if you of your colleagues at the Carter Center have witnessed this kind of sort of overly skeptical observer or sort of hostile observer phenomenon in other countries that you've seen, or is this really a kind of sort of unique or more recent phenomenon that we're seeing now in the US?
Thanks, Gary. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. It's great.
Excellent. Good. Well, thank you so much for the question, Gary, and thank you also to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person to see all of your faces, so I'll just see little tiny faces on the screen, but it's really lovely to be here. And I think this is a great question, and as I was sort of reflecting on it just now, I think I might sort of take a step back and think a little bit about who are observers, right? When we talk about observers, who do we mean? Because there are lots of different kinds of observers. There are partisan observers. So these are, observers that the parties are sending to the polling precincts that we know as watchers or challengers, but then there are also nonpartisan observers. And the way that we communicate with these different kinds of observers might be quite different based on sort of what their interests are in observing. So we know partisan observers are really there to sort of protect the interests of a candidate or a party or a ballot initiative. And often nonpartisan observers, they may be academics who are researching the elections. They may be civil society organizations that really just have an interest in the process itself and not the results or outcome. And so, how we communicate with these different kinds of observers really depends on their interests. I mean, in our experience, partisan observers tend to be more skeptical because they are acting on the part of a candidate or a party. Sometimes that skepticism is legitimate skepticism. Sometimes that skepticism is sort of a political tool that they're using to, as we know, engender uncertainty about the results because that's in their party and candidates or candidates' interests. And that's not to say at all, of course, that nonpartisan observers are not sometimes skeptical too. And I think we probably have seen and will see nonpartisan groups who are observing who say they're nonpartisan, but may have specific agendas. I think what we've seen internationally is that actually a good measure for addressing skepticism or hostility, particularly in partisan observers, is actually having nonpartisan observation be more of a established part of how we think about the transparency of our election processes. Having other people there that are independent, objective eyes on the process can help mitigate some of the dis or misinformation that those maybe partisan hostile observers may try and foment. And also just having extra people there can kind of actually calm down potentially tense or hostile situations. I know that there were some comments earlier about, and actually Jennifer was just mentioning a lot of great tips for sort of increasing transparency and having toolkits and fact sheets and things like that. I think those are all great ways of kind of building a rapport with a number of different kinds of observers and trying to sort of build relationships with observers in advance of that observation process that can help tamp down some of that hostility. But I mean, it's not unusual, but I think the degree is perhaps unusual, the degree that we see here.
And I'm also sort of wondering, and I know in a prior panel, it was emphasized the sort of value of having the nonpartisan observers. So I think it really amplifies and confirms, Avery, what you're saying. What I know you've written along with your colleagues at Alliance for Securing Democracy about the role of nonpartisan observation and how it's perhaps a little bit underemphasized in the US right now in many jurisdictions. And so we saw earlier today when Bo was mentioning in Arizona, the sort of important role that having those nonpartisan observers there at the Coliseum played. I know you recommended in that report that you co-authored with ASD that nonpartisan observers was kind of a recommendation directed at the observers, actually, that they should actually learn about the process before they go in, understand what they're looking at, maybe sit in on a poll worker training if they're permitted to. I was wondering if you would sort of go further and recommend, should election administrators be sort of trying to bring those observers in advance and invite them in to sit on the poll worker trainings, maybe offer a specialized training for observers. I was just wondering what your thoughts are about that, because it's not a recommendation I've actually seen carried out a great deal in the United States. People tend to get their trainings from the organization they're working for, whether that be a political party or a nonpartisan group. So I was wondering what role you think the election officials themselves should play in trying to make that happen.
Yeah, that is a great question. So I do think that there is a role for election administrators, and not necessarily directly training observers. You know, obviously, we know that election administrators are really busy and don't necessarily have time to add one more thing to the long list of issues that they're dealing with in advance of an election. But I think that there is a role for them to play maybe well in advance of the election, getting back to this point about like fact sheets and standard operating procedures, where the sort of raw material of how the election operates can be shared so that there's some quality control in the information that maybe others are using to train observers. I mean, I think for me, there are two really sort of distinct areas that trainings need to cover for observers. On the one hand, there is the many different aspects and factors that roll into good election administration processes and sort of understanding the nuts and bolts of election administration, understanding the safeguards, understanding, you know, that all of those layers of security that Jennifer was describing is really critical. And I think this is where we have often fallen short in observer training in this country, is that people just don't have that depth of knowledge. They don't know what they're seeing and they take it out of context. But I think the other area is that we really need to have much more emphasis on sort of helping observers understand their role, their rights, and their responsibilities. And so being very clear from the outset about what it is that they're there to do, what they can do, what they can't do, and importantly, what behavior is going to result in them being asked to leave or excusing themselves from the process. And so I think, you know, that is something that also needs to be included in observer training. I would hope that election administrators would have a big role in sort of helping to define, particularly on this roles and responsibilities element, what that looks like and how that is conveyed to observers. And that actually that training about the roles and responsibilities of observers is also much more embedded in the training for poll workers so that they feel empowered to know when people, you know, where those lines are and what they can do about it. I think, you know, there are some great examples of training that observers have to take before they are accredited or certified as observers. Colorado has an online course where you have to complete a certification before you can get your badge to be an observer. I think that is a great model. It works really well in states where there's maybe more centralized election administration processes. It may be more difficult in states where jurisdictions are smaller and maybe vary more, but I think it's important to try and figure out what elements of the training for observers could be sort of standardized in larger geographical buckets to sort of help alleviate the burden on election administrators so that they don't have to create everything. Maybe there's some toolkits that could be used and then they could add on modules that are much more specific to what happens in their jurisdiction. this may be something, for example, that state associations of clerks or recorders could help with, is sort of thinking about what some of these larger modules are that then others could add on to. But I mean, I think training is essential for really good, credible observation.
I think that's great. And I was also struck on some of the earlier panels by the role of journalists and the role that they're currently playing, given that we maybe don't have as robust a system of nonpartisan observation in the United States as we sometimes have, you know, when the Carter Center is going in to foreign states and observing their elections. We've seen how journalists have kind of stepped in and filled that role. And those journalists being well educated in advance, we saw in earlier panels today, was so crucial. Jen Fifield in Maricopa County needed to know that blue pens were really, really bad. So she was able to really raise the alarm bell about that. And I think it did strike me that if these training materials were provided, toolkits, those sorts of things for observers, they'd also be really great resources for the media as well. And I'm sure local journalists would love to have that information at their fingertips as well. I wanted to bring in Wendy now and talk a little bit about, since you do have so much experience with the types of legislative reforms that have been being passed, what kinds of things are on the minds of elected officials lately. I was wondering what your thoughts are about communications between election administrators and elected officials, and in particular legislative members. We heard a law earlier today about from Recorder Richer about some elected officials maybe not sort of knowing better, and then sort of pushing disinformation despite knowing better. And so given that context, I was wondering what your thoughts are about sort of opportunities or the promise of improving those lines of communication between election officials and the actual elected officials who are sometimes passing reforms that are maybe problematic for election officials, or exercising oversight and investigative powers, as we saw with the Arizona Senate, and sort of ways of building up that communication so that those exercises of power may be done in a more informed and responsible way.
Well, thanks very much. And it's wonderful to be here with you all. I do work for the National Conference of State Legislatures, which is the nation's bipartisan organization supporting the work of the legislators and the legislative staff. So I always need to say that wherever I might go. Some of what I might mention here probably works not only for the lawmakers, but also for the budget makers. I think a lot of the local election officials are turning to their county commissioners or whatever the Board of Supervisors might be called. But I will, of course, focus more on legislators. And what I've learned from being with you for a few hours now is that there's two kinds of communication we're talking about, and it might help to sort of separate them. And one is wholesale, and that would be social media. What are we doing to communicate broadly? And the other is retail, and that is what are we doing to communicate with individuals who might be useful. So over the course of the day, we've heard that it's good to be in touch in advance with reporters. We've heard it's good to be in touch with judges and the district attorney. Those are two that wouldn't have crossed my mind before. We've heard it's good to have contacts with the social media platforms and with law enforcement. So I just want to be sure to add to that list of the retail side, the person-to-person side of communications, lawmakers and other elected officials. So I know that this is kind of spinning in a Pollyanna kind of a way, but I do think that the 2020 election brought to the forefront how our elections work. And the policy choices that are in front of legislators are based on their constituents coming to them with concerns, which, we can go back and back and back. Where does this come from? But I just want to say that there were 3,600 bills in 2021 to change in one way or another how elections are run in the various states and territories. Is that a big number or a small number? I'm telling you, it's a really big number. It's something like 40% more than what we would ordinarily expect. So this means that the attention is now coming from your lawmakers towards elections, and that gives you an opportunity. There might be more of an interest in communicating with you all both ways because this is a headline grabbing topic right now. So with that in mind, I do think that I've got one thing that maybe will help. We'll see. You all can tell me if I'm really, truly a Pollyanna. And that is that you all need to communicate. And you know what? They need to communicate too. They have a whole audience of their own that they're trying to figure out what the message is. And so if there's a way that you and they can have the same message and they can become trusted messengers for you all, that's what you're all looking for. How do you say in short bite that the elections are being done in a way with lots of checks and balances? So they're interested in that too. But they have a need that maybe you don't have, and that is to come up with some policy changes or at least tweaks that can make the elections more secure and more efficient. Let's go with those two things for now. Your need might not be to make that kind of change, but you might have some unsexy things that you would like to have changed. Maybe you want to make it easier to get poll workers, or maybe you need ballot design to not be constrained by state law, or maybe you've got some deadlines that are tricky for you. So these things aren't very sexy, and you're not going to get headlines for them, but you got some needs that a little change on the edges might make your lives easier. So if you can find the frame where those things that you're interested in will increase accuracy, will increase security, will increase efficiency, there's a common bond there. So you may have some ideas that are useful in your state that they can take forward and be able to say, and it could really be true, make the elections run better. There's no such thing as a perfect election. So there's always going to be room for some continuous improvement. So I think that's the kind of the connecting place. And then my second point would be that if you're going to get in touch with these folks, of course, you're going to invite them to your office, as we've talked about. And of course, you're going to ask them if they'd like to get a cup of coffee with you, these kinds of things. And I know that we've talked all day long about the extra things that you should do. You should do this, and you should do this, and you should do this. And I know that's really hard. But when I've had the opportunity to go out to election offices and bring lawmakers with me, and I do that virtually everywhere I go, including here in Minnesota, I'm going to do that later today. It's always an eye opener and a start for a relationship. So if there's a takeaway on the retail side of communications, it's about building relationships, and that can work with not only the reporters, which we talked about quite a lot, but also with your legislators as well.
Thank you. I wanted to return to Jennifer for one more thought, because you really are such an expert on getting procedures written down and really transparency in procedures like audits and that sort of thing. I wanted to talk a little bit about this sort of relationship between communications and transparency. We've heard a lot about it today, about sort of massive increases in public records requests. We've heard about just, sort of previously sleepy processes, and now suddenly tons of people wanting to observe. It really strikes me that anytime that, and obviously election administrators are just so pro transparency, right? Like that is the name of the game. That is what everyone believes in. But anytime you have information that's provided as a form of transparency, it can be abused, right? And we have seen that over the course of the past few years. So I'm thinking of, there was a live stream of the tabulation center in Philadelphia in 2020, and that was abused to make it appear as if some election workers were filling out ballots when in fact they were duplicating spoiled ballots, which is was a pre-written process that they needed to follow in Pennsylvania for processing spoiled ballots. Those would be ballots that may have been torn or had coffee spilled on them or that sort of thing. So they couldn't automatically go through the tabulator. I'm also thinking of, I know in Fulton County, Georgia, photographs by observers were taken of bins that were full of little shredded strips of paper. And then the accusation was made that ballots were being shredded when in fact, those were the ends of the envelope that the envelope slicer takes off when lots and lots of mail ballots were being processed. So there is always this possibility for transparency to be abused. And then the third example I can think of actually is just data. So all the, huge amounts of data that, for instance, North Carolina is putting out that we've heard about today. We have seen instances of data being abused, right? And sort of, sort of misleading uses of data that make it appear as if more people voted than were registered or something like that, or more ballots came back than were actually mailed out. I believe we saw that in Maricopa County, for instance. So I'm interested, Jennifer, in what kinds of tips you have or resources folks can look to think about how to provide context for all this information that they're giving to the public. So you mentioned the EAC document. It has some tips for putting up signage in tabulation centers and at audits, so that if someone's taking pictures or video, you can see what's happening in each section of the room, color-coded signage. Yeah, I'm just wondering what kinds of resources people can look to really provide that context so that they can be transparent the way they want to, but reduce the possibility of that abuse.
So I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I'll just say, as an election official, your ability to give context to any of these things, whether it's operational or the data, as well as the ability of your staff to give context if they're asked, really starts with your ability to be able to describe and articulate accurately and succinctly how your processes work. So I can't overemphasize having written documented procedures. And the reason I keep harping on this is it's one thing that I see in a lot of offices I visit that's lacking. They know it up here and lots of their staff know it up here, but having it documented really helps. And then when we think about some of the operational things, so you mentioned ballot duplication or replication, the whole mail ballot process we know is actually a number of steps, right? And we have ballots moving through each of those steps from the time that they're received in the office through verification, deconstruction, separation, flattening, scanning, storing, auditing. So anything that's operational like that, you can alleviate some of those things with those infographic sort of informational materials. I can't tell you how valuable just a simple sign created in Word that explains this is a recycle bin and this is what goes in this bin taped onto that bin. So for those types of things, that written printed material can be super useful and super helpful. And it's especially important if you make the decision to live stream any of your operations, which there are pros and cons to. Certainly it does create transparency, but without context also can open up misinformation. As we sort of move along to think about voter data and our voter databases, I think the most important thing here is to make clear to everybody that you talk to that this is a dynamic database. And I think sometimes that's lost. Individuals think it's a static thing and they take that data, either it's made publicly on your website or they request it or pay for that. But it's changing every day. I know for some jurisdictions, there might be a little freeze period where there aren't updates, but for the most part, every day we're adding new names, we're taking names off, we're updating addresses, we're changing party affiliation. One way, and I have to credit Judd actually for this that I think is brilliant in giving context to that, is finding ways to show sort of daily snapshots of how that data changes. So today we updated X number of voters, or we changed this number of addresses, or we changed party affiliations on certain number of voters, just so that people are aware that it's constantly changing and that a list that they got from some organization or group claiming fraud maybe doesn't tell the whole story. And then last, I'll just hit on ballot images and our vote equipment, our vote tallying equipment. I know that there are some jurisdictions that are making those images available. I think it's really tricky. You also need to make available like the cast vote record, I think, if you're going to do that, so that there's an understanding of what happened with that ballot and how the voting system interpreted that ballot. And key there is helping stakeholders and voters and others understand that there's often marginal marks made by voters, especially when we're talking about hand-marked paper ballots or voter intent issues where a ballot hasn't been marked perfectly, and there's an adjudication process that takes place. We all know how this works. We do it in our offices, but communicating that in a way that helps people understand that simple snapshot of a ballot image maybe doesn't tell the whole story. And one last thing I was just thinking about while we were sitting here and thinking about context around things, it may also be helpful to do a little deep dive explainer of how your voting equipment works. And I say that because there's a growing well, we're seeing some proposed legislation, Wendy can probably echo this better than I, demanding a move from electronic tabulation equipment to hand-marked paper ballots. And I think it's important for individuals to understand the role that voting equipment plays in making this process accurate and efficient. I don't know how we demonstrate the failings of hand counting, but maybe helping to sort of drum up the positive side of what your voting equipment brings to you could be helpful in giving context there.
Okay. We have some audience questions, and I have one final question that I want to ask after the audience questions. So I'm going to go to the audience questions right now, actually. So this first one, I think really could go to any of you, but maybe we'll start with Avery, and then we'll see if Jennifer and Wendy want to chime in. And the question is, what makes a nonpartisan observer nonpartisan? So in such a polarized political climate, can anyone who pays attention be sincerely nonpartisan? Or do we mean training observers to act and communicate in behaviorally nonpartisan ways? And the person asks temporarily, at least. So I guess we could start with Avery and then see if Jennifer or Wendy want to chime in.
That is a great question. And I think, it would be naive to think that, you're going to be completely able to put your personal views about the situation in our country, your political views to one side when you are serving as a nonpartisan observer. For us, a nonpartisan observer is someone, though, who does try to put them aside for the time that they are doing this job, and that their sole interest is on ensuring that the process of the election is fair and free for everyone, and that the procedures are followed. So you can sort of take your, I'm an independent voter or a libertarian, your hat off and say, for right now, my duty is that I am a champion of this process for everyone, and I want to make sure that this process works. And so maybe calling it nonpartisan is, maybe it's not the right term or the best term in this highly polarized situation in which we find ourselves, because it's hard for us to wrap our heads around what nonpartisan would truly mean. But until we come up with a better term, that is how we think of it, as someone who is really focused on the integrity of the process for everyone, and really focused on, not just sort of scrutinizing the process for the sake of scrutinizing it, but really thinking about, the ways that they, as a nonpartisan objective observer, can be an ambassador for the process, can help share good information about the process to friends and family members of their community, because it's sort of neighbors serving neighbors as observers. But they can also support election administrators by providing that information back. And in fact, when we train citizen observers all over the world, one of the main goals is that, they're providing public reports about how the process went and recommendations for how to improve future elections, because we know no election is perfect. There's always something to learn, but unless you sort of provide that information back to the people who are running the elections, they're not necessarily going to have a way to know what's happening across all of the polling places that you have observed. And so sort of having it be a conversation and thinking about how nonpartisan observers can be an ally in this communication world, I think is also something that I would just throw in there as a free thought.
I really like that, Avery. And I like the idea that the goal should really be, if we do catch problems, to fix them and make sure that the election is as free and fair as possible, as opposed to, maybe scoring points or that sort of thing. Jennifer and Wendy, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I'll just add, I think we could benefit from a code of conduct. We have our poll workers and our staff take an oath to uphold the laws. I know when I worked in both city and county government, the human resource guidelines were clear. I was entitled to a political opinion, but when I was doing my job, I had a code of conduct or a set of standards that I had to uphold. We can look even in the private sector. We look at professional auditors. They're required to accept a code of conduct, a code of standards that says, I'll work in a way that's unbiased, that is in the public's best interest. So I think that that's another important piece of that. I know Avery and her colleagues came up with some standards of conduct for observers as well. So I think that could be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just add that it could be that academics can help us a little bit here if they create a standard, a form, some expectations, and they can send students out to, thinking grad students out to look at what's happened and then bring back, and then professor or whomever can collate that. And I say that because the University of New Mexico used to do that in New Mexico and provided a report back on basically about how procedures were followed to the best of their ability to represent that.
I love that. And I want to mention here, there's a second question here, but I don't think I need to throw it to you guys. It's just, where can we find that report that Pam and Jennifer mentioned earlier? So maybe, I don't know if those organizing the conference could potentially put it in the chat or share it with the participants once it's out.
electionsgroup.com. Check back in a few weeks.
Okay, so it's not published yet for whoever asked that question. I'm sure for others who are interested, but it will be ready in a few weeks. And so electionsgroup.com would be a great place, and potentially the conference organizers might be able to share it with the registrants who participated today. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of time, and I want to ask the question that I came up with on the fly today. So it's going to be a little bit of a surprise to you guys. So this morning, for those of us who are here in person at the conference, a few of us were chatting in the morning over our coffee over things that we do to kind of maintain our mental health and our sanity. And I wanted to ask, even though it might not be what you're expecting to be asked, the three of you, if you have any tips on that front, because it is true that we've talked a lot today about it's good to do this, it's good to do that, build up the relationship with the local reporter, monitor the social media, talk to the people who are answering the phone every day to find out what they're hearing. And it is just a lot, right? And it has been ongoing since 2020, the sort of level of the capacity that people have had to work at and sort of nonstop for many election officials. They didn't have that odd year off that they generally are hoping to get because there was so much disinformation being spread in 2021. So I mostly wanted to ask the question just so that those election administrators who are watching online know that we see you, even those of us who are not election officials, who kind of work adjacent in this space, have been feeling this stress and the sort of nonstop nature of it as well. So you're not alone. And I thought this would be a good way to just get some tips from those of you on the panel. What kinds of things have you been doing over the last 2 years to try to keep yourself going and healthy? Do you want to start, Jennifer?
I knew you were going to say that. I feel the least qualified to offer advice on maintaining balance. Two things, I guess. I think it's important to constantly remind yourself that you don't have to solve all of this on your own. I know I have to remind myself that there are lots of people, like all of the amazing people you've heard from today, organizations, nonprofits, academic institutions. I, as an election official, got so much help from college students and universities. So there are a lot of groups and organizations willing to help out there, and you just need to reach out and take advantage of that. I think second is we're in a marathon, not a sprint. And it's hard sometimes because your phone starts ringing or the email starts happening in the wee hours of the morning, and you could keep answering those emails and calls until the late hours of the day. But if you treat it like a sprint and do that, you're going to burn out and you're not going to be around for the long run. And we need all of you. We need all of us sort of for the long run to keep our democracy. So carving out time. I do yoga. I like to bake. I do a lot of cooking. And I think when Pam talks about telling your story, I think part of that is you need to have some of those interesting hobbies so that when you are talking to the media, you can tell them, in addition to running elections, I run, I bake, I sew, I take pictures, whatever. So.
Thank you. Wendy, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I was going to go with some stuff that all sounds like a great big should, and what local election officials don't need is any more should. So I'm not going to mention eating or exercise or sleep. They're over there. Instead, Karen said earlier that she likes to celebrate. So if we could celebrate the victories, whatever they might be, Yahoo, and also show appreciation. So when we give appreciation, it makes us feel good as well as making the other person feel good.
And then Avery, I'll let you close it out before we turn it over to Judd.
Thanks. I love that idea of celebration. This is actually something that we've been thinking about a lot at the Carter Center because for those of you who don't know, Mrs. Carter has been a big advocate for mental health for 50 years. She recently received an award from the World Health Organization for 50 years of leadership in mental health. So we think about this a lot, and we've been thinking about it in the context of what it means to be an election administrator right now. And, some of we've sort of talked to a number of people, and some of the ideas that have come back from election administrators are, it can be hard, for example, to share the experience of being sort of burnt out or, all of the threats and harassment that people are receiving. It's hard to find support even from your friends and family because they just don't know what to say. But that often turning to other people who are in similar situations can be really helpful. So finding your friends and colleagues that are other election administrators that maybe you don't see that often, maybe you just see them at annual conferences or at events like this, finding ways where you can say, hey, could we have a cup of coffee? And you can just talk about these things with someone who shared the experience can be really helpful. And then, not to have a should, but a little bit of, when you're really beating yourself up, because I know a lot of us are perfectionists when we think about, people who work on elections are perfectionists. Just have a little bit of compassion for yourself and ask yourself, would you be that hard on a friend of yours or a colleague of yours? And if you would say no, and you'd say, oh, they're doing the best they can, then you should think that about yourself too. So just trying to take a moment to just pause and be a little kind to yourself so that you can enjoy your baking and your yoga and your celebrations.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to Judd to close things out. It's been a great conference so far.
Thank you, Gowrie. Fantastic last panel. I just want to thank everybody. First of all, I want to thank all the people that have stuck with us all day. Even during that last panel, we still had 250, 270 people still with us after 3+ hours of talking nonstop about elections and largely about election mis and disinformation, which can be really taxing to try to take in for hour after hour. Also, thank you so much to all the people that joined us remotely and those who traveled in and drove in to join us. It's such a great thing to get together and be a part of an election community. And I think I can speak for everybody who joined us that it was just one great panel after another all day. And I get so much out of this. And I have this great anticipation that those that were watching got a lot out of it too. And you'll see that happening. You'll see some of the things that we talked about today sort of manifest themselves in the work that they do. And by the way, we had over 600 people sign up. We had 350 or so people that actually joined. That's a pretty good attrition rate. Usually you don't do that well. You usually lose a lot more people than that. So that's fantastic. And so many of those are and have been elections administrators. And that's one of the things that I hope is the biggest takeaway from this event, which is that the University of Minnesota has the Humphrey School or Humphrey School CEA program, the Certificate of Elections Administration program. And there is a big group of people, there's a big community of folks who do the work that you do, want to do the work that you do, and have this level of knowledge and insight. And we're all having conversations. We're all doing this in classroom formats. And it's not like going back to graduate school. You don't worry. You're not going to have to, pass the GRE or get your LSAT taken care of to join us. It's a great program with really interesting classes taught by people who really know their stuff. So we invite you to look into that, find out more about the CEA program. And the easiest way to do that would be if you just do a Google search or a DuckDuckGo search or a Bing search, put in HHH CEA. CEA stands for Certificate of Elections Administration. If you put in HHH CEA, the first thing you'll go to is that program, and you can learn all about the classes and offerings through the University of Minnesota. A couple of things I wanted to highlight. We kind of did that in the last panel, but a couple of big takeaways that I think you might find useful. We talked about forming relationships with media, going and building out your social media where you can. Bring in people for tours, create an environment where people feel like they're welcome to learn more about your elections administration. And then also talk to them when there's a problem. Try to make lemonade out of your bad moment, because they happen in every situation. I think Wendy mentioned there is no such thing as a perfect election because the laws are complicated, the policies are complicated, and you got a lot of humans working it. So you're not going to have a perfect environment, but that's a really great takeaway and one of the strongest takeaways from this morning and throughout the day. This idea of use and connect to allies. The United States Postal Service, if you're worried about vote by mail, connect with USPS, have them describe the kinds of work that they are doing. We had a whole debate during the Maricopa panel about whether you should respond or how you should respond to the various kinds of things that occur and you find out about on social media. It's a great question. And frankly, I think it is sort of subject to who you are that day. But be conscientious about that, because that can be a tricky thing. And then to jump ahead to a couple of the more recent, Jennifer, who I've heard her say this a number of times because it's such an important point, and that is develop and build out your processes. Write them down, let people know what you're doing and how you're doing it, so that when you need to say that you do something right or demonstrate where something went off the rails, you can do that through some sort of written document. And then lastly, and I think Gowrie was wonderful to include this, take care of yourself, take a vacation. It's okay. You can get away from it. And do stuff that you enjoy. You don't have to be inundated with the sort of doom and gloom of elections work, which frankly has never been that before. But I think it's, I feel it, and it's all sort of tangible now. And so try to get away from that, because you do really important work. You are public servants, and you do incredibly important public service. So you want to feel good about that. I feel good about it, but sometimes I have to remind myself, because it's not as fun as it used to be. But that doesn't mean that you're not doing anything less important. You just need to, take a break, get some sleep, and then, go at it the next day. So thank you again. We so enjoyed having this conference and welcoming you all into this program. And, have a great weekend and restart Monday rejuvenated with your little to-do list of things you can do to improve. Thank you very much.